The crack of gunfire split the rain-soaked night as Caleb Mercer stood alone in the muddy street, his Colt .45 smoking in his hand. 3 men lay groaning in the dirt, and behind him, the woman he'd met just days ago clutched a shotgun with trembling hands. He'd ridden into Whispering Pines for flour and coffee, simple supplies for a simple man. But now, with blood on his boots and Lydia Hartwell's desperate proposal ringing in his ears, Caleb realized his solitary life was about to change forever. Friends, if you want to know how a routine supply run turned into the most dramatic love story the frontier ever witnessed, stay with me until the end. And please comment below which town you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this tale has traveled. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as Caleb Mercer guided his weathered chestnut mare down the winding path toward Whispering Pines. The leather of his saddle creaked with each steady step, a rhythm he'd grown accustomed to over 15 years of solitary ranching. His calloused hands held the reins with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than roofs, more conversations with horses than humans. At 34, Caleb carried the weight of his years in the deep lines around his steel-gray eyes and the permanent squint that came from too many days staring across sun-bleached plains. His jaw covered in 3 days' worth of stubble clenched unconsciously as the first buildings of the town came into view. Towns meant people. People meant complications. And Caleb Mercer had learned long ago that complications had a way of leaving scars, both the kind you could see and the kind that kept you awake at night. The list in his vest pocket was simple enough. Flour, coffee salt, ammunition, new rope, and maybe if Murphy's General Store had it, a new whetstone for his knife. 2 hours at most, he figured. He'd be back at his ranch by sunset, back to the comfortable silence of his cabin, where the only sounds were the wind through the canyon and the occasional cry of a hawk. Whispering Pines sprawled before him like a picture from one of those Eastern magazines he'd once seen, false-fronted buildings trying to look bigger than they were, painted signs advertising promises they couldn't keep, and people hustling about with the nervous energy of those trying to build civilization out of wilderness. The town had grown since his last visit 6 months ago. New buildings stretched along what the locals optimistically called Main Street, and the sound of hammering echoed from multiple construction sites. Progress, Caleb muttered to his mare Buttercup, a name that seemed to amuse everyone who heard it, given that she was anything but delicate. That's what they call it when they crowd too many folks into too small a space. Buttercup snorted, shaking her mane as if in agreement. She'd been with him 8 years now, bought from a Cherokee trader who swore she had the heart of a warrior. Caleb had to admit the old man hadn't lied. Buttercup had carried him through blizzards, floods, and one memorable encounter with a grizzly that still made his shoulder ache when the weather turned. He tied her to the hitching post outside Murphy's, taking a moment to run his hand along her neck. "Won't be long, girl. We'll get what we need and get out before—" The crash of breaking glass cut through his words, followed by a woman's sharp cry of anger rather than fear. Caleb's head turned toward the sound, his body tensing instinctively. 30 yards down the street outside what looked like a millinery shop, a scene was unfolding that made his jaw tighten. A woman in a burgundy dress stood with her back against the shop's wall, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her chin raised in defiance despite the massive figure looming over her. The man was built like a bull, broad shoulders, thick neck hands like ham hocks. Even from this distance, Caleb could smell the whiskey rolling off him in waves. "I said you're coming with me, Lydia," the brute slurred, grabbing for the woman's arm. "You've been playing high and mighty for too long. Time someone taught you proper respect." The woman Lydia jerked away, her eyes flashing. "The only thing you'll teach Frank Tillman is how to be a perfect example of what decent folks should avoid. Now remove yourself from my presence before I'm forced to involve the sheriff." Frank Tillman laughed an ugly sound that made several passers-by quicken their steps, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. "The sheriff? You mean my cousin?" "Yeah, you go ahead and call him sweetheart. See how much good that does you." Caleb's fingers flexed. "Not your business," he told himself. "You don't know these people. You don't know their history. Get your supplies and go." But then Tillman grabbed Lydia's wrist, twisting it hard enough to make her gasp, and Caleb's feet were moving before his brain could catch up. "Morning, folks, he said, his voice carrying that deceptive casualness that anyone who really knew him would recognize as dangerous. Beautiful day for a walk, though I'm thinking the lady might prefer to take hers alone. Tillman turned his bloodshot eyes, struggling to focus on the newcomer. Caleb stood relaxed, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, looking for all the world like a man discussing the weather. But there was something in his stance, in the way his right hand hung just so, that made even drunk men think twice. "This ain't your concern, cowboy," Tillman growled, though his grip on Lydia's wrist loosened slightly. "Why don't you mosey on back to whatever rock you crawled out from under?" Caleb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, now that's the thing about concerns. They have a funny way of becoming mine when I see a man putting hands on a lady who clearly doesn't welcome the attention. So how about you let her go, and we can all get on with our day?" "You don't know who you're messing with," Tillman said, releasing Lydia to face Caleb fully. "I own half this town. My family owns the other half. You're nothing but a saddle tramp who—" "Frank?" The woman's voice cut through his tirade like a blade through butter. "This gentleman is trying to offer you a graceful exit from what's about to become a very ungraceful situation. I suggest you take it." Tillman's face flushed darker. "You threatening me now, schoolmarm?" "No," Lydia said calmly, straightening her dress. "I'm educating you. There's a difference, though I understand you might struggle with the distinction." The insult landed like a slap. Tillman's face went from red to purple, and he took a step toward Lydia, his hand rising. But before he could complete the motion, Caleb was there, his movement so swift and economical that several onlookers missed it entirely. One moment he was standing 3 feet away. The next his hand had caught Tillman's wrist in a grip that made the bigger man's eyes water. "Now that," Caleb said softly, "would be a mistake." "You son of a—" Tillman swung with his free hand a haymaker that would have dropped most men. But Caleb had been in too many fights, survived too many desperate moments to be caught by such a telegraphed blow. He ducked under it, using Tillman's momentum against him, and sent the big man stumbling into the street. Tillman caught himself spinning around with surprising agility for a drunk man his size. His hand went to his hip, where the handle of a revolver protruded from a worn holster. "Frank, no!" Lydia stepped forward, but Caleb's arm barred her path. "Go ahead," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent street. "Pull it. But you should know I've been shooting pistols since I was 12. Killed my first man at 17 when bandits hit our wagon train. Spent 3 years scouting for the army fighting Apaches who could put an arrow through your eye at 50 yards. Lost track of how many men I've put in the ground who thought they were faster than they were. So go ahead, Mr. Tillman, pull that iron, but make sure you're ready for what comes next." The street had gone tomb quiet. Even the hammering from the construction sites had stopped. Tillman's hand hovered over his gun, trembling slightly. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "This ain't over." He finally spat his hand, dropping away from the weapon. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, stranger. You and that uptight I'd choose your next word very carefully." Caleb interrupted, his hand now resting on his own Colt. "Very carefully." Tillman's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he turned and stomped away, shoving aside 2 men who didn't move out of his way fast enough. "This ain't over," he shouted again over his shoulder. "You hear me? This ain't over." Caleb watched until Tillman disappeared into a saloon down the street, then turned to find Lydia studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 or 26. Her eyes were the color of sage honey, flecked with gold that caught the morning light. There was a small scar above her left eyebrow, nearly hidden by a strand of dark hair that had escaped her pins. "Thank you," she said simply. "Though I should warn you, you've just made an enemy of one of the most vindictive men in Wyoming territory." Caleb shrugged. "Won't be the first. Likely won't be the last. You really killed a man when you were 17. Didn't have much choice in the matter. It was him or my sister." The words came out before he could stop them. He never talked about Margaret. Never. Something shifted in Lydia's expression, understanding perhaps or recognition of a kindred spirit who'd seen too much too young. "I'm Lydia Hartwell. I teach at the schoolhouse." She gestured toward a small building with a bell tower at the end of the street. "And you are—" "Caleb Mercer. I ranch about 30 miles north of here, up near Devil's Canyon." Her eyebrows rose slightly. Devil's Canyon. That's harsh country. Not many men tough enough to make a go of it up there alone. Suits me fine. Harsh country keeps the visitors to a minimum. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. And yet here you are visiting town. Man's got to buy supplies sometime. Speaking of which, he touched the brim of his hat. I should get to it. You be all right, Miss Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell, she corrected, then added quickly. Widow. And yes, I'll be fine. Frank Tillman is all bluster and bourbon. He'll sleep it off and find someone else to harass tomorrow. Something in her tone suggested she didn't quite believe her own words, but Caleb didn't press. Wasn't his business. He had supplies to buy and a ranch to get back to. Ma'am, he said, touching his hat brim again, and turned toward Murphy's. Mr. Mercer. Her voice stopped him. Might I ask, where are you staying tonight? It's a long ride back to Devil's Canyon. Surely you're not planning to attempt it after dark. Caleb half turned. Figured I'd camp outside town a ways. Done it before. Nonsense. There's a storm coming in. Can't you smell it? Besides, after what just happened, you might find it prudent to stay somewhere with walls and a lock. Widow Perkins runs a clean boarding house, serves the best stew in 3 counties. It's the blue house with white trim 2 blocks over on Cedar Street. He studied her for a moment, this woman who'd stood up to a brute twice her size without flinching, who now seemed genuinely concerned for the welfare of a stranger who'd involved himself in her troubles. I appreciate the suggestion, ma'am. It's not a suggestion, Mr. Mercer. It's sound advice from someone who knows this town and its temperaments. Frank Tillman doesn't forget slights, and he's got friends who share his disposition. You do well to watch your back. With that, she turned and walked away, her stride purposeful, despite what must have been shaking nerves. Caleb watched her go, noting the way people nodded respectfully as she passed. The way she stopped to speak kindly to an old woman selling flowers, the way she knelt to tie a young boy's bootlace when she noticed it dragging. Complicated, he muttered to himself, then pushed through the door into Murphy's. The general store was exactly what he'd expected. Crowded shelves stretching to the ceiling, barrels of pickles and crackers, the mixed scents of leather and coffee and tobacco, creating that particular perfume unique to frontier mercantiles. Patrick Murphy himself stood behind the counter, a slight man with thinning red hair and nervous hands that never seemed to stop moving. Help you, mister? Caleb pulled out his list, but his mind kept drifting to the scene outside. The way Lydia had stood her ground, the flash of fear quickly masked by defiance, the slight tremor in her hand that she'd hidden by smoothing her skirt. Mr. He shook his head, focusing. Need these supplies. And information if you've got it. Murphy took the list, squinting at Caleb's cramped handwriting. Information costs extra. Caleb placed a silver dollar on the counter. Frank Tillman. What's his story? Murphy's hand stilled for perhaps the first time since Caleb had entered. His eyes darted to the window, then back. Why you asking? Had a run-in with him outside. Like to know what I'm dealing with. Murphy pocketed the dollar with the swift motion of a man who'd learned to take opportunities when they arose. Frank Tillman's bad news wrapped in worse news. His daddy owns the biggest cattle operation in the county. His uncle's the territorial judge. His cousin's the sheriff. Frank himself owns the Golden Nugget Saloon, has fingers in half the businesses in town, and thinks that gives him rights to whatever and whoever he wants. And Mrs. Hartwell, Murphy's expression softened slightly. Now there's a tragedy. Came here 3 years ago with her husband, good man named Thomas. He was going to start a newspaper. She was going to teach school. 6 months later, Thomas was dead, officially ruled an accident, but plenty of folks had their doubts. Lydia stayed on teaching the children, refusing to be run off despite difficulties. What kind of difficulties? The kind that come when a young pretty widow won't accept the protection of certain interested parties. She's proud, Mrs. Hartwell. Maybe too proud for her own good. Tillman's been after her for 2 years now. She keeps refusing him, and he keeps getting meaner about it. Caleb absorbed this information as Murphy began gathering his supplies. Through the window, he could see the street returning to normal people emerging from doorways where they'd taken shelter during the confrontation. But there was a tension in the air now, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. Your funeral, Meister Murphy, said, apparently reading Caleb's thoughts. Man who stands between Frank Tillman and something he wants tends to have a short, painful life. Just ask Thomas Hartwell. Oh, wait, you can't. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as Murphy continued filling his order. An hour later, Caleb emerged from Murphy's with his supplies loaded into canvas sacks. The sun had climbed higher, but clouds were indeed building to the west, dark and pregnant with rain. He could smell the storm coming, that metallic tang that promised a deluge. He loaded his supplies onto Buttercup, his movements automatic as his mind worked through the situation. Smart thing would be to mount up now, ride hard, and make it at least halfway home before the storm hit. Find shelter in one of the caves he knew along the trail. Be back at his ranch by tomorrow noon, back to his routine, his solitude, his uncomplicated life. Instead, he found himself leading Buttercup towards Cedar Street. The boarding house was easy to find, blue with white trim, just as Lydia had described, with a neat garden out front and lace curtains in the windows. A painted sign declared it Mrs. Perkins' boarding house, clean rooms, hot meals, fair prices. The woman who answered his knock was somewhere north of 60, with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked him up and down with the frank assessment of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly. "You'd be the fellow who stood up to Frank Tillman this morning," she said without preamble. "Word travels fast. Faster than wildfire in a town this size. You looking for a room? If you've got one available." She studied him another moment, then stepped aside. 25 cents for the night includes supper and breakfast. No drinking, no smoking, no guests in your room after 9 o'clock. Break my rules and you will be out on your ear faster than you can say, "Jack Robinson." I don't care if it's raining hellfire outside, understood? Yes, ma'am. Good. You can stable your horse around back, there's feed and water. Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late or you don't eat. She showed him to a small but clean room on the second floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the street. The bed had a quilt that looked handmade, and there was a Bible on the nightstand. "This'll do fine," Caleb said. "I should hope so. It's the best room in the house, though. Don't go spreading that around. I'll have every cowpoke in Wyoming wanting it." She paused at the door. "That was a good thing you did this morning? Lydia Hartwell deserves better than the likes of Frank Tillman pawing at her." "You know her well." "Well enough. She takes Sunday dinner here, sometimes helps me with my letters. My eyes aren't what they used to be. She's a good woman, Mr. Mercer. Caleb Mercer." "Mr. Mercer. She's a good woman who's had more than her share of sorrow. But I suspect you figured that out already." With that cryptic comment, she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly feeling the weight of the morning's events. He'd come to town for supplies. Simple supplies. Now he'd made an enemy of the most powerful man in town, gotten himself tangled in some local drama, and was spending money on a room he didn't need because a woman with honey-colored eyes had suggested it. He pulled off his boots, dust falling from them onto the clean floor. He'd sweep it up later, apologize to Mrs. Perkins. For now, he lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town outside, horses and wagons, voices calling to each other, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. At 6 sharp, he made his way downstairs to the dining room. 3 other boarders were already seated at the long table, a traveling merchant with soft hands and a softer middle, an old prospector who looked like he'd been carved from leather and disappointment, and a young man who couldn't have been more than 18 wearing a suit that was trying too hard to make him look older than he was. "Gentlemen," Mrs. Perkins announced, "this is Mr. Mercer. He'll be joining us for supper. Mr. Mercer, that's Mr. Donnelly, our merchant from Kansas City. Old Pete, who's been looking for gold in these hills longer than you've been alive. And young Mr. Clarence, who's here to learn the banking trade." Caleb nodded to each in turn, taking a seat at the far end of the table where he could watch the door. Old habits. "Heard you had a run-in with Frank Tillman," Donnelly said without preamble, his small eyes glinting with the hunger for gossip that seemed to sustain traveling merchants as much as food. "Word does travel fast," Caleb observed. "Fastest thing in town aside from Frank's temper," Old Pete cackled. "You picked a hell of an enemy friend. Tillman's got a memory like an elephant and a mean streak wider than the Platte River." "He was accosting a lady," young Clarence said, his voice cracking slightly. "Any gentleman would have intervened." Old Pete snorted. Plenty of gentlemen in this town, boy. Notice how none of them were intervening. That's because they know better. Tillman owns half of everything and has his fingers in the other half. You saying I should have let him continue? Caleb asked mildly. I'm saying you should have minded your own business, Pete replied. That's how a man stays alive out here. That's also how a man stops being a man, Caleb said quietly. The door opened before Pete could respond, and Lydia Hartwell entered, shaking raindrops from a dark shawl. She'd changed from the burgundy dress into a simpler gray one, but her hair was neatly pinned again, and she carried herself with the same quiet dignity Caleb had noticed that morning. Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Perkins beamed. I wasn't expecting you tonight. I hope it's all right, Mrs. Perkins. I confess I didn't feel comfortable dining alone at home this evening. Her eyes found Caleb. Mr. Mercer, I see you took my advice about lodging. Seemed prudent, Caleb replied, standing as she approached the table. The other men hastily followed suit, Clarence nearly knocking over his water glass in his eagerness. Lydia took a seat across from Caleb, and Mrs. Perkins bustled in with a pot of stew that smelled like heaven after weeks of Caleb's own rough cooking. There was fresh bread, too, still warm from the oven, and butter that melted into golden pools. So, Mr. Mercer, Lydia said as they ate. What brings a rancher from Devil's Canyon to our humble town? Surely not just supplies. Just supplies, Caleb confirmed, though it seems I've gotten more than I bargained for. That does tend to happen in Whispering Pines. We're a town that doesn't believe in simple transactions. Everything comes with complications. There was a wry humor in her voice, but also a warning. Speaking of complications, Donnelly interjected, leaning forward conspiratorially. I heard Frank was in the Golden Nugget drinking heavily and making threats. Said he was going to teach someone a lesson they wouldn't forget. Lydia's hand stilled for a moment, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Frank's always making threats when he drinks. It's his primary form of communication. These seem more specific than usual, Donnelly pressed. He was talking about hiring some men from out of town, gunmen from what I gathered. Now where would you gather such information, Mr. Donnelly? Mrs. Perkins asked sharply. I hope you haven't been frequenting that den of iniquity. Donnelly flushed. I merely stopped in to conduct some business. A merchant must go where his customers are. Mrs. Perkins's opinion of that excuse was clear. Gunmen, old Pete mused. That's Tillman's style, all right. Can't fight his own battles, so he pays others to do it for him. No offense, Mercer, but you might want to consider moving on come morning. Maybe find another town for your supplies. I've got everything I came for, Caleb said, but I appreciate the concern. Do you have family? Mr. Mercer? Lydia asked suddenly. People who depend on you back at your ranch. The question caught him off guard. No family, just me and a few hundred head of cattle. That must be lonely. He shrugged. It's peaceful. Man knows where he stands when it's just him and the land. And where he falls, she murmured so quietly he almost missed it. Thunder rumbled outside, and the rain that had been threatening all day finally arrived in earnest, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Mrs. Perkins lit more lamps against the gathering gloom, and the dining room took on a warm, golden glow that made the storm outside seem very far away. Tell us about Devil's Canyon, Mr. Mercer, young Clarence said eagerly. I've heard stories. Is it really haunted? Caleb almost smiled. Not haunted, just inhospitable. The canyon gets its name from the wind that howls through it. At night sounds like souls in torment if you're of a fanciful mind. But it's good land if you know how to work it. Water year-round from mountain runoff grass that stays green longer than the lower valleys, and natural barriers that keep the cattle from straying too far. How long have you been there? Lydia asked. 6 years come fall. Claimed the land myself, built the cabin and barn with my own hands. Started with 20 head of cattle, built it up from there. That's impressive, she said, and seemed to mean it. Not many men could manage that alone. Not many men would want to, old Pete added. What drives a man to seek that kind of solitude? Caleb was quiet for a moment, aware that everyone at the table was waiting for his answer. Sometimes a man's had enough of people. Sometimes he needs space to figure out who he is when there's nobody around to tell him. And have you, Lydia asked, Figured out who you are." Their eyes met across the table, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest like a door opening that had been locked for a very long time. "I thought I had." "Thought—" She caught the past tense. Before he could answer, the front door burst open, bringing with it a gust of wind and rain, and the figure of a young boy, maybe 12 years old, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "Tommy Morrison," Mrs. Perkins scolded. "What on earth are you doing out in this weather?" "Looking for Mrs. Hartwell," the boy gasped. "Mr. Tillman. He's at your house, ma'am. Him and 3 other men. They're breaking things. Said they won't leave until you come talk to him." Lydia was on her feet before the boy finished speaking, her face pale but determined. "Is Sheriff Tillman there?" Tommy shook his head. "No, ma'am. My pa went to fetch him, but he said it was a private matter and he couldn't interfere." "Of course he did." Lydia's voice was bitter. She moved toward the door, but Caleb was faster, blocking her path. "You can't go out there. Not with him drunk and angry and with 3 men backing him up." "It's my home, Mr. Mercer. My belongings. Everything I have left of—" She stopped, composed herself. "I won't let him destroy everything I've worked for." "Then I'm coming with you." "This isn't your fight. It became mine this morning when I stepped between you and him. Man doesn't start something he's not willing to finish." She studied him for a long moment, rain drumming against the windows, the other boarders watching in tense silence. "You could get hurt or killed. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried. Haven't succeeded yet. This is different. This is a bully and his paid thugs terrorizing a woman. I've seen it before, Mrs. Hartwell. It doesn't end until someone makes it end." Old Pete stood up, surprising everyone. "I may be old, but I can still shoot straight. I'll come too. And me," young Clarence added, though his voice shook. I have a pistol." "Ever fired it, boy?" Caleb asked. "Once. At a target. Hit it." "No." Despite everything, Caleb felt his mouth twitch toward a smile. "You stay here, keep Mrs. Perkins and Mr. Donnelly safe in case this goes bad. Pete, I appreciate the offer, but nothing. I've lived in this town for 15 years, watched the Tillmans squeeze it dry, bit by bit. Maybe it's time someone said enough. Besides," he grinned, showing gaps where teeth should have been, "I'm too old to care much about dying and too mean to go easy." Caleb looked at Lydia. "Your call, ma'am. It's your home." She lifted her chin, and in that moment, despite her rain-dampened shawl and worried eyes, she looked like a queen. "Let's go." They went into the storm, Caleb, Lydia, and old Pete, while Tommy ran off to gather more men of good conscience, though Caleb doubted many would answer that call. The rain hit like fists, cold and heavy, turning the street into a river of mud. Lightning split the sky at irregular intervals, illuminating the town in brief, stark moments of white light. Lydia's house was at the far end of town, a modest 2-story structure with what had probably been a nice garden before someone had trampled through it. Light blazed from every window, and Caleb could hear the crash of breaking furniture, even over the storm. "How do you want to play this?" Old Pete asked, checking his ancient Remington. "Straight on," Caleb replied. "They're drunk, overconfident. They won't expect a direct approach." He walked up to the front door, which hung askew on its hinges, and stepped inside without hesitation. The parlor was a disaster: chairs, overturned books scattered across the floor, a mirror shattered into glittering fragments. Frank Tillman stood in the center of it all, a bottle in one hand, using the other to sweep items off the mantelpiece. 3 other men lounged around the room, all armed, all wearing the satisfied expressions of bullies who thought they were untouchable. They straightened when Caleb entered, hands moving toward their weapons. "Well, well," Tillman slurred, turning to face him. "The hero returns. Come to save your lady love." "Come to tell you to get out," Caleb said evenly. "You've had your tantrum. Now it's time to go home and sleep it off." Tillman laughed, taking a swig from his bottle. "I don't think so. See, you embarrassed me this morning, made me look weak in front of the whole town. That requires compensation." "What kind of compensation?" "The kind where you crawl out of here on your belly, begging my forgiveness. And the lovely Mrs. Hartwell agrees to have dinner with me tomorrow night. A proper dinner where she'll wear something pretty and remember her manners." "I'd rather dine with the devil himself," Lydia said, from behind Caleb, stepping into her ruined home with remarkable composure. That can be arranged too, one of Tillman's men said with an ugly laugh. Caleb had been in enough fights to recognize the moment when talking ended and violence began. It was in the shift of weight, the tightening of muscles, the sharp intake of breath before action. He saw it in the man closest to him, the one whose hand had been inching toward his gun throughout the conversation. The man went for his weapon and Caleb moved. Not for his own gun, but forward, closing the distance before the other could clear leather. His fist connected with the man's jaw with a sound like a tree branch breaking, and the man went down hard, his pistol spinning across the floor. Everything erupted at once. Tillman threw his bottle at Caleb's head, missing by inches, the glass shattering against the wall. The second hired gun got his pistol out, but hesitated, not wanting to hit Tillman in the close quarters. That hesitation cost him as Old Pete's Remington boomed, the shot taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The third man was smarter, diving behind an overturned table, firing wild shots that sent everyone scrambling for cover. Caleb rolled behind a heavy oak sideboard, drawing his Colt in one smooth motion. Splinters exploded above his head as bullets chewed into the wood. "Give it up, Tillman!" he shouted. "You've lost like hell!" Tillman had found his own gun, a fancy nickel-plated piece that looked more like a showpiece than a serious weapon. He fired it anyway, the shots going wide, punching holes in his own ceiling. Lydia had pressed herself into the corner by the door, but she wasn't cowering. She'd picked up a poker from the fireplace and looked ready to use it on anyone who came close. The third gunman made a break for the window, apparently deciding that whatever Tillman was paying wasn't worth dying for. He almost made it before Caleb's shot caught him in the leg, sending him crashing through the glass and into the muddy garden beyond. That left Tillman standing in the middle of the destroyed parlor, his fancy gun clicking on empty chambers, too drunk to realize he'd fired all his rounds. "It's over," Caleb said, standing slowly, keeping his Colt trained on the bigger man. "It's never over," Tillman screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "I own this town. I own everything. You're nothing. You're—" The poker caught him across the back of his knees, dropping him like a felled tree. Lydia stood over him, breathing hard, the poker raised for another strike, if necessary. "You own nothing in my home, Frank Tillman," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You're a small, pathetic man who thinks money can buy him respect and fear can buy him love. But all it's bought you is emptiness. Now get out. Crawl if you have to, but get out of my home." Tillman looked up at her, then at Caleb, then at Old Pete, who still had his Remington trained on him. Something broke in his expression, the bravado crumbling to reveal the petty coward underneath. He crawled toward the door, leaving a trail of mud and blood from where he'd cut his hands on the broken glass. At the threshold he turned back, his face twisted with hatred. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction now. "You'll pay for this. All of you." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but not tonight. Tonight you're going to go home, think about your choices, and maybe realize that there are some things in this world your daddy's money can't buy, like courage, or dignity, or a woman like Mrs. Hartwell." Tillman's face went purple, but he said nothing more, stumbling out into the storm. They could hear him retching in the garden, then cursing as he tried to help his wounded associates. Caleb turned to survey the damage. The parlor was destroyed water coming in through the broken window books and belongings scattered everywhere. Lydia stood in the middle of it all, still holding the poker, looking lost. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This happened because of me, because I interfered this morning." She shook her head slowly. "No. This happened because Frank Tillman is a monster who's never been told no. It would have happened eventually whether you were here or not. At least this time I wasn't alone." Old Pete cleared his throat. "We should get you somewhere safe, Mrs. Hartwell. He'll be back, and next time he might not come drunk." "Where would I go?" she asked, gesturing at the ruined room. "This is my home. Everything I have is here." "Mrs. Perkins will put you up," Caleb said. "We'll get some men to board up the window, salvage what we can. Tomorrow in the daylight we can assess the damage properly." She looked around again, and Caleb saw her shoulders start to shake. Not with fear or sadness, but with exhaustion. The kind that came when adrenaline faded and left nothing but the weight of what had happened. Without thinking, he moved to her, gently taking the poker from her hands. "Come on, let's get you out of here." She nodded, allowing him to guide her toward the door. but at the threshold she stopped looking back at her destroyed parlor. "My husband gave me those books," she said softly, "for our anniversary. Said a teacher should never stop learning." "We'll save them," Caleb promised. "Everyone we can." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, the rain lessening to a drizzle. A crowd had gathered despite the weather, townspeople drawn by the gunshots watching from safe distances. Some looked sympathetic, others merely curious, but none had come to help. "Cowards," old Pete spat. "Every last one of them." "They're scared," Lydia said tiredly. "I don't blame them. The Tillmans have run this town for so long, people have forgotten what it's like to stand up to them." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Caleb noticed Sheriff Tillman standing under the awning of his office, watching them pass. The family resemblance to Frank was clear, the same heavy features, the same cruel mouth. He made no move to investigate the disturbance, no pretense of doing his job. "There'll be consequences," the sheriff called out as they passed. "Attacking prominent citizens, disturbing the peace. I'll have to look into it." Caleb stopped, turning to face him. "You do that, Sheriff. And while you're at it, look into prominent citizens breaking into women's homes, destroying property, and threatening violence. I'm sure the territorial judge would be interested to hear about it." "Oh wait, that's your uncle, isn't it?" "How convenient." The sheriff's face darkened. "You're playing a dangerous game, stranger." "Maybe, but at least I'm playing it standing up, not hiding behind a badge I don't deserve." He turned away before the sheriff could respond, catching up with Lydia and Pete. Behind them he could hear muttering from the crowd, discussions that would become gossip, that would become legend. By tomorrow the story would have grown in the telling, become something more than what it was. But right now it was just 3 people walking through the rain, one of them having lost almost everything she owned, another too old for gunfights but too stubborn to admit it, and the third wondering how a simple supply run had turned into this. At the boarding house, Mrs. Perkins took charge, bustling Lydia upstairs to a hot bath and dry clothes, sending Clarence to fetch the doctor to look at the graze on old Pete's arm that he'd been hiding, and sitting Caleb down with a cup of coffee that could have stripped paint. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," she said bluntly. "The Tillmans won't let this go." "I know. They'll come at you sideways. That's their way. Legal troubles, hired guns, maybe an accident that isn't an accident. They've done it before." "You're talking about Lydia's husband." Mrs. Perkins's mouth tightened. "Thomas Hartwell was a good man. Came here with dreams of starting a newspaper, bringing truth to the frontier. 6 months later, his wagon went off a cliff. Horse supposedly spooked. Only the horse was found shot, and Thomas had told me the day before that he'd gotten threats if he published his story about the Tillmans' land grab schemes. And nobody investigated. Who would Sheriff Tillman? Judge Tillman. The whole system's rigged, Mr. Mercer. Has been for years." Caleb stared into his coffee, seeing patterns in the dark liquid. "Someone needs to change that." "Someone?" Mrs. Perkins gave him a sharp look. "You planning on being that someone? A man who came to town for flour and coffee. Plans change. So do men if they live long enough." She stood, joints creaking. "I've got a room ready for Mrs. Hartwell. You might want to check on her later. Woman doesn't lose everything she owns and just shake it off no matter how strong she seems." But when Caleb knocked on Lydia's door an hour later, she answered, looking composed, wearing a borrowed dress that was a size too large, her hair down around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said awkwardly, hat in hand. "Please come in." She stepped aside and he entered to find her salvaged books spread across the bed, many waterlogged and muddy but intact. "Mrs. Perkins's nephew went and got them for me. Most can be saved, I think." "That's good." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why did you step in this morning?" "You don't know me. You had no stake in this." Caleb thought about it, wanting to give her an honest answer. "My sister Margaret was about your age when bandits attacked our wagon train. I was 17, thought I was a man. But I froze when they grabbed her, just stood there like my feet were nailed to the ground, while they hurt her. She died 3 days later, fever from her injuries." Lydia's hand went to her throat. "Oh, Caleb, I'm so sorry." He shrugged the gesture, not quite hiding the old pain. It was a long time ago, but I swore that day I'd never stand by again when someone needed help. Never freeze when it mattered. So when I saw Tillman grabbing you, he trailed off. You saw your sister. Maybe, or maybe I just saw a bully who needed stopping. He met her eyes. Either way, I'm not sorry I stepped in. Just sorry it cost you your home. It's just things mostly. They can be replaced. Can they? Mrs. Perkins told me about your husband, about what the Tillmans might have done. Her composure cracked slightly. Thomas was everything good in this world. Kind, principled, brave. He wanted to make this town better, to bring truth and justice to a place that had forgotten what those words meant, and they killed him for it. You can't prove that. No, but I know it, just like I know they'll come for you now. She moved closer, and he could smell lavender soap from her bath. You should leave tonight. Take your supplies and go back to Devil's Canyon. Forget this town and everyone in it, including you. The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Lydia's eyes searched his face, looking for something, truth, maybe, or intention. Especially me, she said softly. I'm poison to good men, Mr. Mercer. Ask Thomas. Oh, wait, you can't. You're not poison. You're just a woman trying to live her life in a place where powerful men think they own everything. And look how well that's working out. He wanted to touch her to offer comfort, but didn't know if it would be welcome. You could leave too. Start fresh somewhere else. With what money? Everything I have is tied up in this house, and who would buy it now? Besides, I have a contract with the school board. 23 children depending on me to teach them their letters and numbers. I can't just abandon them. Even if staying might get you killed. We all die sometime, Mr. Mercer. The question is whether we die as ourselves or as something less. She turned to the window, looking out at the wet street below. Thomas used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's continuing despite the fear. I'm terrified every single day, but I continue. You shouldn't have to face it alone. She turned back to him, a sad smile on her face. But I am alone. That's the reality of my situation. I'm a widow with debts, no family, and enemies who literally own this town. Not exactly the stuff of fairy tales. Debts. She flushed slightly. Thomas had borrowed money to start the newspaper. When he died, it came to me. I've been paying it back slowly for my teaching salary, but it's never enough. Frank Tillman bought the note from the bank last year. He offers to forgive it regularly in exchange for companionship. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. How much? $300. Might as well be $3,000 for all the hope I have of paying it. $300. Caleb had more than that in the bank in Cheyenne, profits from last year's cattle drive. Money he'd been saving for what more cattle? Another barn. What was the point of building something if there was no one to share it with? He pushed the thought aside. He'd known this woman exactly one day. One eventful day, granted, but still just one day. Men who made decisions based on one day's acquaintance were fools. You should get some rest, he said instead. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Will you be here tomorrow, or will you take my advice and leave? I haven't decided yet. She nodded, accepting that. Thank you again, Mr. Mercer, for everything today. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that. He left her there among her damaged books, closing the door softly behind him. Sleep eluded Caleb that night. He lay on the narrow bed, listening to the rain taper off into silence, his mind churning over the day's events. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lydia standing in her ruined parlor, poker in hand, fierce and fragile all at once. He'd come to town for supplies and somehow found himself in the middle of a war he hadn't started and couldn't walk away from. Dawn came gray and uncertain, matching his mood. He dressed quietly, strapped on his gun belt with practiced ease, and made his way downstairs. Mrs. Perkins was already in the kitchen kneading bread dough with violent efficiency. "You're up early," she observed without looking at him. "Habit. Ranch work starts before the sun." "So does trouble in this town." She turned to face him, flour dusting her hands. "There's been talk already this morning. Frank Tillman's offering $500 to any man who runs you out of town. $1,000 if you don't survive the running." Caleb poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "That's a lot of money." Enough to bring every gunslinger and desperate man within 50 miles. You still thinking of staying? Before he could answer, the kitchen door opened, and Lydia entered, dressed in the same borrowed dress from the night before, her face pale but determined. He's staying because of me, she said quietly. Which is why I need to speak with him. Alone. Mrs. Perkins looked between them, then shrugged. I'll be in the dining room. Try not to bleed on my clean floor if you're planning something foolish. When she was gone, Lydia moved closer to Caleb, close enough that he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands she was trying to hide. I've been thinking all night, she began, about solutions, ways out of this that don't end with you dead in the street. I'm listening. She took a deep breath as if steeling herself for what came next. There's one thing Frank Tillman wants more than revenge: respectability, social standing, the appearance of having won. She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. If you were to leave town publicly defeated and I were to accept his suit, he might let you live. Caleb set down his coffee cup, carefully controlling the sudden rage that flared in his chest. You're talking about sacrificing yourself. I'm talking about survival. Yours and mine. No. You don't get to make that choice for me. I'm not making any choice for you. I'm telling you that I won't run while you throw yourself to that wolf. Find another solution. There is no other solution. Her composure cracked tears, threatening. Don't you understand? The Tillmans always win. Always. They have the money, the power, the guns. All we have is pride, and pride gets people killed. Sometimes it's worth dying for. Easy for you to say. You don't have 23 children depending on you to show up Monday morning and teach them that there's more to life than violence and corruption. They stood there facing each other across the kitchen, two stubborn people who'd seen too much of life's harsh edges to believe in easy answers. There might be another way, Caleb said slowly, an idea forming. Tillman's pride is his weakness. He needs to be seen as powerful in control. What if we take that away from him? How? Make him look weak, publicly. Force him into a position where backing down is his only option that saves face. Lydia shook her head. You don't know him. He'd rather burn the whole town down than look weak. Then maybe it's time this town burned. At her shocked look, he quickly added, metaphorically, sometimes things need to be torn down before they can be rebuilt right. Before she could respond, they heard commotion from the street. Caleb moved to the window, peering out carefully. A group of men had gathered outside, at least a dozen, all armed. At their center stood Frank Tillman, looking worse for wear, but righteously angry. Mercer, Tillman's voice boomed across the morning air. Get out here and face me like a man. He's calling you out, Lydia breathed. In front of witnesses. If you don't go. I look like a coward. Caleb checked his Colt, spinning the cylinder. And if I do go, it's probably a trap. Definitely a trap. Those men with him aren't locals. They're hired guns. Caleb studied the group more carefully. She was right. The men flanking Tillman had that particular stillness that came from years of violence, the kind of calm that preceded storms. Stay here, he told Lydia. Caleb. He stopped at her use of his first name. What? Don't die, please. He touched the brim of his hat. I'll do my best, ma'am. He walked out onto the porch, letting the door close loudly behind him to announce his presence. The crowd turned toward him like a single organism, hands dropping to weapons. Morning, Tillman, Caleb called out, staying on the porch where he had the high ground. You're up early for a man who was crawling through mud last night. Tillman's face flushed. You assaulted me in my fiancé's home. She's not your fiancé. She will be once you're gone. Tillman smiled, an ugly expression on his battered face. See? I've been thinking, this town isn't big enough for both of us. So here's my proposition, we settle this like men. Single combat, you and me. Winner stays, loser leaves town forever. And if I refuse, then my associates here will be forced to defend my honor, all 12 of them. Caleb scanned the hired guns. Hard men, experienced killers. He was good, but he wasn't that good. Nobody was. Just you and me, he clarified. No interference. On my word as a gentleman. Old Pete's cackle came from somewhere to Caleb's left. Your word ain't worth the spit it takes to say it, Tillman. Stay out of this, old man, unless you want to join your friend in the grave. Caleb made his decision. It was a trap, certainly, but sometimes the only way out of a trap was through it. All right, Tillman, you and me. Right here, right now. No. Lydia's voice came from behind him, but he didn't turn. Tillman's smile widened. Excellent. Boys, give us room. The hired guns spread out, forming a rough circle, hands still hovering near their weapons. The message was clear: Caleb might win the fight, but he wouldn't survive the aftermath. Tillman pulled off his coat, handing it to one of his men. Underneath, Caleb could see the bulk of the man, the raw physical power that made him dangerous even without a gun. This wasn't going to be a quick draw contest. This was going to be brutal. Fists, Tillman announced, like real men. Unless you're too scared to face me without your gun. Caleb understood the game now. Tillman was bigger, stronger, and probably a decent brawler. He wanted to beat Caleb to death with his bare hands in front of the town, establish dominance through primitive violence. Caleb, don't, Lydia called again, but he was already unbuckling his gun belt, hanging it on the porch rail. Your move, he told Tillman. The big man charged like a bull, no finesse, just raw power and rage. Caleb sidestepped at the last second, driving his elbow into Tillman's kidney as he passed. Tillman grunted, stumbling but not falling, spinning around with surprising agility. That all you got? Tillman taunted, raising his fists in a boxer's stance. They circled each other, the crowd growing as word spread through town. Caleb could hear bets being placed, most of them against him. He couldn't blame them. Tillman had 4 inches and 50 pounds on him. Tillman struck first, this time a straight right that Caleb barely avoided, feeling the wind of it pass his cheek. The follow-up left caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He rolled with the blow, using the momentum to create distance, but Tillman pressed forward, relentless. Another heavy punch grazed Caleb's shoulder, numbing his arm. Tillman was grinning now, confident, playing to the crowd. This is what happens when drifters think they can come into my town, Tillman announced loudly, throwing another haymaker. This time Caleb was ready. He ducked under the swing, came up inside Tillman's guard, and drove 3 quick punches into the bigger man's solar plexus. Tillman's eyes bulged, his mouth opening in a soundless gasp as his diaphragm seized. Caleb didn't give him time to recover. Years of ranch work had given him a wiry strength that Tillman's bulk couldn't match for speed. He grabbed Tillman's shirt, used the man's own weight against him, and threw him hard into the mud that still pooled in the street. Tillman landed face first, sputtering and cursing. When he pushed himself up, his nose was bloody, his fancy clothes ruined. The crowd had gone quiet. Get up, Caleb said quietly. Unless you're done. Tillman's hand went to his boot, and Caleb saw the glint of metal, a hidden knife. But before Tillman could draw it, a shot rang out. Sheriff Tillman stood at the edge of the crowd, his pistol pointed skyward. That's enough, the sheriff announced. This has gone far enough. Stay out of this, cousin, Frank snarled, getting to his feet. I'm not here for you, Frank. The sheriff's eyes were on Caleb. I'm arresting this man for assault, disturbing the peace and destruction of property. On whose complaint must... Lydia stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly. I haven't filed any complaint. In fact, Mr. Mercer was defending my property from intruders. Frank's filing the complaint, the sheriff said smoothly. Says you assaulted him in his fiancé's home. I'm not his fiancé. Lydia's voice cracked with frustration. How many times do I have to say it? Way I heard it, you've got debts to Frank. Significant debts. Man's got a right to collect what he's owed. Since when is marriage a form of debt collection? Old Pete demanded. The sheriff shrugged. Judge can sort it out. For now, Mercer comes with me. Caleb saw the trap closing. Get him in jail and he'd never make it to trial. Too many accidents could happen in a cell. I'll come peacefully, he said, surprising everyone. But I want witnesses, lots of them. And I want to see Judge Tillman today, not tomorrow, not next week. Today. The sheriff hesitated. Public pressure was a funny thing. Too many witnesses meant too many questions if something went wrong. Fine, he agreed grudgingly. Trial's at noon. Don't try to run. Wouldn't dream of it. As the sheriff approached with shackles, Lydia moved close to Caleb. This is my fault, she whispered. No, he said firmly. This is what happens when bullies run out of other options. Be at the trial. Bring everyone you can. What are you planning? Something probably stupid. He managed a slight smile. Seems to be my specialty lately. The jail was everything Caleb expected: 2 cells, brick walls, a single barred window, and the persistent smell of despair and urine. Sheriff Tillman locked him in the larger cell, then settled behind his desk with obvious satisfaction. "You should have left when you had the chance," the sheriff said conversationally. "Now you're going to learn what happens to troublemakers in Whispering Pines. Your cousin going to be at the trial." "Frank?" "Oh, he'll be there, cleaned up sober, playing the wronged party. Very convincing." "And your uncle Judge Tillman?" The sheriff grinned. "He's particularly harsh on outsiders who disturb the peace. Wouldn't surprise me if you got 6 months hard labor. Of course, the work camps are dangerous, a lot of accidents. Men fall off cliffs, get crushed by rocks. Tragic, really." Caleb settled onto the thin cot, appearing unconcerned. "You ever wonder what it's like? Living your whole life in someone else's shadow? Your cousins, your uncles. When do you get to be your own man?" The sheriff's face darkened. "Watch your mouth. Just observing. Must be hard always being Sheriff Tillman, but never just your own name. What is your first name anyway? None of your business. Let me guess something traditional. William, Robert, no. James. You look like a James." The sheriff stood abruptly. "I've got rounds to make. Try not to hang yourself while I'm gone. Would be a shame if you missed your trial." After he left, Caleb examined his cell carefully. Solid construction, no obvious weaknesses. The window was too small and too high. The lock was new, well maintained. If he was getting out of this, it wouldn't be through escape. Time passed slowly. Through the window, he could hear the town waking up properly. Voices and wagon wheels and the rhythm of daily life. Somewhere out there, Lydia was probably teaching her students, trying to maintain normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. Around 11, the door opened and an unexpected visitor entered. It was Clarence, the young would-be banker from the boarding house, looking nervous but determined. "Sheriff said I couldn't see you," he said quickly, "but he's at the saloon. I wanted to help." "Appreciate the thought, but unless you've got a key in your pocket, there's not much you can do." "Actually," Clarence pulled out a rolled document. "I've been reading law books, lots of them, and there are procedures that have to be followed. Territorial procedures that even Judge Tillman can't ignore without risking federal intervention." Caleb sat up interested. "Such as, you have the right to representation. You have the right to call witnesses. You have the right to a jury of your peers, not just a judge's decision. And," he paused dramatically, "you have the right to challenge your accuser to trial by combat if the charges involve questions of honor." Trial by combat. That's actually legal. It's an old territorial statute never officially repealed, probably because no one's been crazy enough to invoke it in 20 years. Caleb smiled slowly. "Clarence, you might just be a genius. There's more. I've been going through the town records. Frank Tillman doesn't actually own the note on Mrs. Hartwell's debt. He claimed to have bought it, but there's no official transfer recorded. The bank still owns it, and the bank president, Mr. Morrison, he's no friend of the Tillmans. They forced him out of the cattle business 5 years ago." "You've been busy?" Clarence flushed. "Mrs. Hartwell's a good woman. She taught me to read when I first came here, could barely write my own name. And you stood up to them. Nobody ever stands up to them." "They do now." Caleb moved closer to the bars. "I need you to do something for me. Go to the bank, talk to Morrison. Get him to the trial with those records. Then find Mrs. Hartwell, tell her what you told me about the combat statute. She'll know what to do with it." "What are you going to do?" "What I do best, apparently. Stir up trouble." The courthouse was packed by noon, every seat taken, and people standing along the walls. Word had spread about the morning's confrontation, and the whole town wanted to see how it would end. Judge Tillman sat behind his bench like a toad on a throne, his heavy jowls quivering with barely contained satisfaction. Frank had indeed cleaned up, wearing a fresh suit and an expression of wounded dignity. His nose was swollen and both eyes blackened, which actually helped his case. He looked like a victim. "Bring in the defendant," Judge Tillman intoned. Sheriff Tillman escorted Caleb in the shackles deliberately loud in the quiet courtroom. Caleb scanned the crowd, finding Lydia in the front row, old Pete beside her. Clarence was there too, and surprisingly Mr. Morrison from the bank, looking uncomfortable but resolved. "Caleb Mercer." Judge Tillman began without preamble. You stand accused of assault, disturbing the peace destruction of property, and threatening a prominent citizen. How do you plead? Not guilty, and I invoke my right to representation. The judge's eyes narrowed. You have a lawyer. I represent myself, but I call upon the advice of Mr. Clarence Whitmore, who has studied law extensively. That boy's not a lawyer, so, Frank protested. The statute doesn't require a formal lawyer, Clarence said, standing nervously. Just representation and advice. Judge Tillman looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Fine. Make your case, but make it quick. Caleb stood, the chains rattling. Your Honor, the charges against me are false. I defended Mrs. Hartwell's property from unlawful invasion. Frank Tillman broke into her home with 3 armed men, destroyed her belongings, and threatened her person. I responded with appropriate force to stop a crime in progress. That's a lie, Frank shouted. She's my fiancée. I had every right. I am not your fiancée, Lydia stood up. I have never agreed to marry you, and I never will. You owe me money, Frank snarled. $300. Marriage is a reasonable settlement of that debt. Actually, Mr. Morrison stood slowly. She owes the bank money, not you, Mr. Tillman. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Tillman hammered his gavel. Explain yourself, Morrison. The banker pulled out a ledger. Frank Tillman claimed to have purchased Mrs. Hartwell's note 6 months ago. However, no legal transfer was ever recorded. The bank still holds the note, and as bank president, I'm prepared to offer Mrs. Hartwell revised terms that don't involve matrimony. Frank's face went purple. You can't do that. I can, and I am. The note is bank property, and I decide its disposition. Judge Tillman looked between his nephew and the banker, clearly calculating political costs. Regardless of the debt situation, the assault charges stand. Then I invoke my right to trial by combat, Caleb said clearly. The courtroom erupted. Judge Tillman hammered his gavel repeatedly. Order. Order. That statute hasn't been used in 22 years, Clarence supplied helpfully, but it's still legally binding. Section 14, paragraph 3 of the Territorial Code states that in matters of honor, where facts are disputed, the accused may challenge the accuser to single combat to determine truth. This is ridiculous, Frank protested. It's the law, Caleb said, unless you're afraid to face me again. This time without your hired guns to back you up. The crowd murmured, and Caleb could hear the word coward whispered more than once. Frank's face flushed deeper. I accept, he ground out. Judge Tillman looked like he wanted to object, but the crowd was watching expectant. Too many witnesses, too much attention. Very well, combat will be now, Caleb interrupted. In the street where everyone can see. Fists only, no weapons. First man who can't continue loses. If I win, all charges are dropped, and Frank Tillman agrees to leave Mrs. Hartwell alone permanently. If he wins, I accept the charges and leave town forever. Done, Frank said before his uncle could object. The crowd poured out of the courthouse like water from a broken dam, forming a large circle in the street. This time, there were no hired guns, no hidden knives, just 2 men, and the truth that would be written in blood and bruises. Frank came out swinging, having learned from the morning's encounter. He was more careful now, more tactical, using his reach advantage to keep Caleb at a distance. A solid jab split Caleb's lip, and he tasted copper. But Caleb had learned too. He knew Frank's rhythms, now his tells. When the big man threw his next combination, Caleb was ready. He slipped the first punch, blocked the second, and counterpunched hard to Frank's already broken nose. Frank screamed, staggering back, blood streaming down his face. Caleb pressed his advantage, working the body, each blow calculated to sap strength and wind. Frank tried to clinch to use his weight advantage, but Caleb had wrestled steers stronger than this man. The fight turned brutal. Both men bloodied, exhausted, running on pure will. The crowd had gone silent except for sharp intakes of breath at particularly vicious exchanges. Finally, Frank made a desperate lunge, trying to tackle Caleb to the ground. Caleb pivoted, using Frank's momentum against him, and brought his knee up hard into the man's midsection. Frank collapsed, gasping, unable to rise, though he tried twice. It's over, Caleb said, standing over him. You're done. Sheriff Tillman started forward, hand on his gun, but the crowd closed in protective. Old Pete had his Remington out, pointed casually but meaningfully at the sheriff. "I'd say justice has been served," Mr. Morrison said loudly. "Unless the Tillmans want to argue with the whole town." Judge Tillman looked around at the faces surrounding them. Faces that had been cowed for years but now showed something different. Not quite courage yet, but the beginning of it. "Charges dismissed," he said grudgingly. "Frank, get up. We're leaving." It took 2 men to help Frank to his feet. As they half carried him away, he looked back at Lydia with such hatred that Caleb stepped protectively closer to her. "This isn't over," Frank gasped out. "Yes," Lydia said quietly but firmly. "It is." The crowd began to disperse, people talking excitedly, the story already growing in the telling, but Caleb barely noticed. He was looking at Lydia, who was looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're hurt," she said, reaching up to touch his split lip gently. "Had worse. That seems to be your answer for everything. Don't you ever admit to pain? Not much point in it. Pain passes." "And what doesn't pass?" He looked at her, this woman who'd lost everything but refused to break, who faced down bullies with words as effectively as he did with fists. "Some things," he said quietly. "Some things stay." She smiled, then soft and sad, and somehow hopeful all at once. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up. Mrs. Perkins will have my hide if I let you bleed all over her boarding house." As they walked back together, Caleb noticed something different about the town. People were standing straighter, talking louder, looking directly at each other instead of keeping their eyes down. It was a small change, but it was a start. "You've given them something," Lydia said, noticing his observation. "What's that? Hope. The possibility that the Tillmans aren't invincible. That's a dangerous thing to give people who've been beaten down so long." "Dangerous for who?" "Everyone. Hope makes people do desperate things. Beautiful, terrible, desperate things." That evening, Mrs. Perkins outdid herself with dinner, roast beef, potatoes, green beans, and a pie that could have made angels weep. Word had spread about the day's events, and the dining room was full of townspeople who'd suddenly discovered they needed to board at Mrs. Perkins' establishment. Caleb found himself the center of attention, which he bore with uncomfortable stoicism. People wanted to shake his hand, buy him drinks. He wouldn't accept, tell him their own stories of Tillman oppression. "You're a hero," Clarence said earnestly. "I'm not," Caleb replied. "I'm just a man who doesn't like bullies." "Same thing in a town like this." Lydia sat beside him, and he was acutely aware of her presence, the way she laughed at old Pete's terrible jokes, the way she gently corrected Clarence's legal interpretations, the way her hand occasionally brushed his when reaching for something on the table. As the evening wore on and the crowd thinned, they found themselves alone in the parlor, sitting by the fire Mrs. Perkins had lit against the evening chill. "You're leaving tomorrow, aren't you?" Lydia asked without preamble. "That was the plan. Got my supplies, got more trouble than I bargained for. Time to get back to my ranch." "Of course." She stared into the fire. "It's a smart thing to do. The Tillmans won't forget this. They'll regroup, plan something worse. You should be far away when they do." "What about you?" "I'll do what I always do. Survive. Teach. Try to make a difference in small ways." "That's not much of a life." She turned to him, eyes flashing. "It's the one I have. We can't all run away to Devil's Canyon when things get complicated." "I didn't run away." "Didn't you? 6 years alone on a ranch, no family, no friends, no connections. What would you call it?" The words stung because they held truth. "Survival," he said quietly. "Exactly. We all survive in our own ways, Caleb. Yours is isolation. Mine is stubborn persistence. Neither is wrong, but neither is particularly living either." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Caleb spoke. "Your husband was a lucky man." "He was, right up until he wasn't." She stood abruptly. "I should go. It's been a long day." "Lydia." He stood too, and suddenly they were very close in the small parlor. "Be careful. Frank won't let this go no matter what he said. Men like him with that much pride and that much power, they don't forget." "I know." She looked up at him, and for a moment he thought she might say something more. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed his cheek, a brief, soft touch that burned more than any of his wounds. "Thank you, Caleb Mercer, for everything." Then she was gone, leaving him standing by the fire, touching his cheek like a fool, wondering how a simple supply run had become so complicated. Later that night, as Caleb lay in his narrow bed, he heard voices outside his window. Drunk voices, angry voices, talking about teaching lessons and showing outsiders what happened when they interfered. He recognized some of them, Frank's hired guns from the morning, still in town, still looking for trouble. He checked his Colt, made sure it was loaded and within easy reach. Tomorrow he'd head back to his ranch and his solitude. But tonight he'd stay alert. Because men like the Tillmans didn't give up easily, and the fight was far from over no matter what anyone said in the courtroom. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the distance a dog howled. It sounded lonely, that howl. Or maybe that was just him projecting his own feelings onto the night. He thought about Lydia probably lying awake in her own bed, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He thought about her destroyed home, her salvaged books, her stubborn refusal to be broken. He thought about the way she'd kissed his cheek, the way she'd said his name. Complicated, he muttered to the darkness, and the darkness, as always, had no answer. The sound of shattering glass woke Caleb from his restless sleep. He was on his feet with his Colt in hand before the echo faded, moving to the window in a crouch. Down on the street, he could see figures running, hear shouting that cut through the pre-dawn darkness. His pocket watch showed 3:30 in the morning. "Fire, fire at the schoolhouse." The word sent ice through his veins. Caleb pulled on his boots and jacket, taking the stairs 3 at a time. Mrs. Perkins stood in the hallway in her nightgown, a shotgun in her weathered hands. "It's not the school," she said grimly. "It's Lydia's house." Again. Caleb didn't wait to hear more. He burst out into the street, joining the stream of townspeople running toward the orange glow that lit up the far end of town. But even as he ran, he knew it was wrong, all wrong. The fire was too convenient, too targeted. This was a message, or worse, a distraction. He skidded to a stop, grabbing Clarence, who was running past in his nightshirt. "Get to Mrs. Hartwell at the boarding house. Now, take Pete with you. This is a trap." "But the fire—" "Let others handle the fire. Protect Lydia. Go!" Clarence ran back toward the boarding house, and Caleb forced himself to think like the predator he'd once been when scouting for the army. If Frank wanted revenge, he wouldn't just burn an empty house. He'd want to hurt Lydia directly, personally. The fire would draw everyone away, leave her vulnerable. Caleb circled back through the alleys, avoiding the main street where most of the town was heading toward the fire. His instincts screamed danger with every step. Too quiet. Too easy. Where were Frank's hired guns? The answer came in the form of a rifle shot that splintered wood inches from his head. Caleb dove behind a water trough as more shots followed, counting muzzle flashes in the darkness. 3 shooters, maybe 4, positioned on rooftops with clear lines of sight on the boarding house. "That's far enough, Mercer." Frank Tillman's voice boomed from somewhere in the shadows. "This is between me and the woman. Walk away now, and you might live to see sunrise." "Can't do that, Frank," Caleb called back, checking his ammunition. 6 shots in the cylinder, another 18 rounds in his belt. Not enough for a prolonged firefight. "Why don't you come out and we can discuss this like civilized men?" Frank's laugh was ugly. "Civilized? You broke my nose, humiliated me in front of the whole town, turned them against me. There's nothing civilized about what happens next." More shots peppered Caleb's position, keeping him pinned. He could hear commotion from the boarding house now, voices raised in alarm, Mrs. Perkins' authoritative commands. They knew something was wrong, but stepping outside would make them targets. "What do you want, Frank?" Lydia's voice rang out clear and unafraid. She must have been at an upstairs window. "Haven't you done enough?" "Not nearly enough, sweetheart. You owe me. Years of courtship money spent, reputation invested. You're going to pay that debt tonight one way or another." "I'd rather die." "That can be arranged too." Caleb heard the distinctive sound of men moving through the alleys, closing in on the boarding house from multiple directions. Frank had brought a small army. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about complete domination, showing the town what happened to those who resisted. A new voice cut through the night. Old Pete somewhere off to Caleb's left. "Hey, Frank, remember what I said about being able to shoot straight?" The Remington boomed, and one of the rooftop shooters cried out, his rifle clattering to the street below. The other gunmen immediately turned their fire toward Pete's position, giving Caleb the opening he needed. He broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground toward the boarding house. Bullets whined past him like angry hornets, but moving targets were hard to hit in the dark. He burst through the front door to find chaos inside Borders, huddled behind overturned furniture, Mrs. Perkins at the window, with her shotgun, and Lydia coming down the stairs with a rifle Caleb didn't know she had. "Where did you—" "It was Thomas's," she said simply. "I kept it hidden. Never thought I'd have to use it. Can you—" "We're about to find out." Glass shattered as bullets tore through the windows. Everyone ducked, and Caleb heard Frank's voice again, closer now. "Last chance, Mercer, send her out, or we burn this place down with everyone in it." "He's not bluffing," Mrs. Perkins said. "I can smell kerosene. They're dousing the walls." Caleb looked around the room at Clarence, terrified but trying to be brave. At Mr. Donnelly, the traveling merchant clutching a derringer like a talisman. At the other innocent boarders who'd done nothing but rent a room for the night. Then he looked at Lydia, her face set with determination, ready to die rather than submit. "No," he said quietly. "No more innocent people get hurt because of this." He raised his voice. "Frank, you want to settle this? Then let's settle it. You and me right now in the street. No hired guns, no fire. Winner takes all." "We already did that dance. I lost." "Not fists this time. Guns. To the death." Silence stretched out, broken only by the crackle of flames from Lydia's house in the distance. Finally, Frank responded, "And when I kill you, then I'm dead and you can continue your business with Mrs. Hartwell. But if I win you and all your men leave town tonight, forever." "Caleb, no." Lydia grabbed his arm. "You can't. It's the only way." He looked down at her, memorizing her face in case it was the last time. "Trust me." "You're on Mercer," Frank called. "Main Street, 5 minutes. Any tricks and my men burn everything." Caleb checked his Colt one more time, spinning the cylinder, feeling the weight of it in his hand. He'd been in gunfights before, but never one with so much riding on it. Not just his life, but Lydia's, the boarding house residents, maybe the soul of the entire town. "You don't have to do this," Lydia said quietly. "Yes, I do. This is what I'm good at. Maybe the only thing I'm good at." "That's not true. Isn't it I came here for supplies, and all I've brought is violence? You brought courage. You showed people they could stand up. And look where it got us." She stepped closer, her voice urgent. "Caleb, I need to tell you something, in case you don't. He touched her lips gently with his finger. "Tell me after. Give me a reason to be faster than him." Outside, the street had filled with people despite the danger. Word spread quickly in Whispering Pines, and it seemed the entire town had turned out to witness this final confrontation. They lined both sides of the street, silent shadows in the pre-dawn darkness lit by torches and the distant glow of the still-burning house. Frank stood in the middle of the street, his gun already strapped on his damaged face, a mask of hatred in the flickering light. His hired guns were positioned strategically, not interfering, but ready to act if needed. "Thought you might run?" Frank said as Caleb approached. "I don't run." "No, you just hide on a ranch for 6 years pretending the world doesn't exist." "Maybe, but I'm here now." They faced each other 20 paces apart. Someone in the crowd was saying words, something about rules, about waiting for a signal, but Caleb wasn't listening. He was watching Frank's eyes, his shoulders, the tiny tells that would announce his draw. "You killed her husband, didn't you?" Caleb said suddenly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. Frank's eyes widened slightly. "That's a lie." "Thomas Hartwell, you had him killed because he was going to publish a story about your family's land grabs, because Lydia chose him over you. You murdered the man she loved out of spite." "Shut up. Everyone knows it. They've always known it. They were just too scared to say it out loud." "I said shut up." "What's wrong, Frank? Don't like the truth. Don't like being exposed for the coward you really are." Frank's hand moved and time slowed to a crawl. Caleb had been in this moment before, the space between decision and action, between life and death. He saw Frank's hand drop to his gun saw, the weapon begin to clear leather. Fast. Frank was faster than Caleb had expected. But Caleb had learned long ago that in a gunfight, smooth was fast and fast was smooth. His draw was economical. No wasted motion, the Colt coming up in a straight line as his thumb cocked the hammer. Frank's gun was out swinging toward him. Caleb could see the barrel a black hole that promised death. Two shots cracked out so close together they sounded like one extended roar. Caleb felt the wind of Frank's bullet pass his ear. For a moment both men stood frozen, and Caleb thought he'd missed, thought this was the end. Then Frank looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. His gun fell from nerveless fingers and he dropped to his knees in the mud. "You," Frank gasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "You can't. My family will. Your family will do nothing." Judge Tillman's voice rang out. The old judge stood at the edge of the crowd, looking older and more tired than Caleb had ever seen him. "It's over, Frank. This feud, this tyranny, it ends here." "Uncle," Frank's voice was weak, confused. "I'm tired, boy. Tired of cleaning up your messes. Tired of the violence. Tired of ruling through fear. You've brought us to this, a Main Street gunfight, like we're common outlaws. Our name used to mean something in this territory. Now it just means brutality." Frank tried to speak again, but only blood came out. He toppled forward into the mud and was still. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sheriff Tillman stepped forward, and Caleb tensed, ready for another fight. But the sheriff simply looked down at his dead cousin, then at Caleb. "It was a fair fight," he said loudly. Everyone saw it. Frank drew first. He looked around at his cousin's hired guns. "You men have 1 hour to leave town. After that, I'll arrest anyone who disturbs the peace." "You're taking his side," one of the gunmen asked incredulously. "I'm taking the law's side, something I should have done a long time ago." The sheriff unpinned his badge, looked at it for a moment, then dropped it in the mud beside Frank's body. "I'm done being a Tillman first and a lawman second." The hired guns looked at each other, realized the tide had turned, and began to drift away. The crowd started to disperse, people talking in hushed voices about what they'd witnessed. History had been made on this street, and everyone knew it. Caleb stood over Frank's body, feeling nothing but exhaustion. Behind him he heard running footsteps, and then Lydia was there, throwing her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "You're alive," she whispered. "You're alive." "Seems that way." She pulled back, hitting him in the chest. "Don't you dare be glib about this. You could have died." "But I didn't." "But you could have." Tears were streaming down her face now. "And it would have been my fault, all my fault." "No." He caught her hands. "None of this was your fault. Frank made his choices. I made mine. You're just the woman who was strong enough to say no to a tyrant." She looked up at him and something shifted in her expression. "Caleb, Mrs. Hartwell. Mr. Morrison." The banker approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but, well, in light of everything that's happened, I wanted you to know that your debt to the bank is forgiven. Consider it a fresh start." Lydia blinked, stunned. "Mr. Morrison, I can't." "You can and you will. This town owes you more than money can repay. You stayed when your husband was killed, kept teaching our children, showed us what courage looks like. This is the least we can do." Others were approaching now, townspeople who'd hidden in their homes for years suddenly finding their voices. They offered help rebuilding her house, temporary lodging donations to replace what had been destroyed. The same people who'd stood by while Frank terrorized her were now eager to make amends. Caleb stepped back, letting Lydia deal with her newfound supporters. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the mountains gold and red. His business here was finished. Frank was dead. Lydia was free, and the town was finding its backbone. Time to go home. He walked to the livery stable where Buttercup waited, probably wondering why breakfast was late. The mare nickered when she saw him nuzzling his shoulder as he saddled her. "Ready to go home, girl, back to the quiet." "You're leaving." He turned to find Lydia standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the morning light. "Job's done. Town's safe. You're free. No reason to stay." "No reason?" She stepped closer. "After everything that's happened, you can't think of a single reason to stay." "What do you want me to say, Lydia?" "That I've fallen for you after 3 days. That I'm ready to give up my ranch, my solitude, everything I've built. That's not who I am. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm asking you to consider gaining something." "Like what?" A life that's more than just survival. A reason to come home that isn't just habit. Someone to share the silence with who understands why you need it. He turned back to Buttercup, adjusting straps that didn't need adjusting. You don't know what you're saying. You're grateful emotional after everything that's happened. In a week, you'll realize I'm just a violent man who brought death to your doorstep. You're right. You are violent. You did bring death. But you're also the man who stood between me and a monster when everyone else looked away. Who risked everything for a woman he barely knew, who gave this town its freedom back. I'm not a hero, Lydia. I'm not looking for a hero. I buried one of those already. Her voice caught. I'm looking for something else. Something I saw in your eyes when you faced Frank in the street. Not courage, lots of men have courage, but purpose. You had purpose for the first time in 6 years. That hit too close to the truth. Caleb turned to face her. What are you proposing? She laughed short and bitter. Interesting choice of words, because I am proposing something insane and desperate, and probably foolish. Lydia, marry me. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Caleb stared at her, sure he'd misheard. What? Marry me, Caleb Mercer. Not for love, I buried that with Thomas. Not for passion, though God knows there's something between us that burns. Marry me for practical reasons. Such as, I need protection. The Tillmans may be broken, but they're not gone. Frank had friends, family who will want revenge. A husband, especially one with your reputation, would make them think twice. And what do I get out of this arrangement? She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes. A reason to be something more than a ghost-haunting Devil's Canyon. Someone who understands loss, who won't push you to be something you're not. A partner, not a burden. You don't know me. I know enough. I know you can't sleep for the ghosts. I know you blame yourself for your sister's death. I know you've been punishing yourself with isolation for 6 years. I know because I recognize the signs. I've been doing the same thing just in a crowded town instead of an empty canyon. Caleb felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built so carefully beginning to crumble. This is crazy. Yes. We barely know each other. Yes. It would never work. Probably not. She smiled sadly. But wouldn't it be better to fail at something real than succeed at slowly dying alone? He wanted to say no, wanted to mount Buttercup and ride away back to his safe, predictable loneliness. But something held him. Maybe it was the way she stood there vulnerable but unafraid. Maybe it was the memory of her wielding that poker fierce as any warrior. Or maybe it was just the exhaustion of running from life for so long. If we did this, he said slowly, it would have to be real, legal, binding. I won't have people saying you're my woman without the law behind it. Agreed. And you'd have to come to the ranch. I'm not living in town. I figured as much. It's hard living, isolated, dangerous, no neighbors for miles. Caleb, I just faced down a man who wanted to own me or kill me. I think I can handle your ranch. What about your teaching, your students? I'll figure something out. Maybe I can come to town once a week or start a school at the ranch for the few children in the canyon. Details can be worked out. He studied her face, looking for doubt, for fear, for any sign that she hadn't thought this through. All he saw was determination and a strange kind of hope. When, he asked, today, now, before either of us comes to our senses. The preacher won't be awake yet. Then we wake him. Caleb, if we wait, if we think about this too much, we'll talk ourselves out of it. And maybe that would be the smart thing. But I'm tired of being smart. I'm tired of being safe. Aren't you? He was. God help him, he was so tired. Tired of the emptiness, the silence that had once been peaceful but had become oppressive. Tired of having nothing to fight for but survival. All right, he heard himself say. All right, let's go wake the preacher. Her smile was like sunrise after a long dark night. Really? Before I change my mind, she stepped forward, rose on her toes, and kissed him. Not on the cheek this time, but full on the mouth. A kiss that tasted of promise and desperation, and something that might, if they were very lucky, grow into love. When she pulled away, they were both breathing hard. That's not going to be a problem, is it? She asked. The physical aspect of marriage. I think we'll manage, he said dryly. They walked through the town, hand in hand, past the smoldering remains of her house, past the spot where Frank's body still lay in the street, past the curious faces peering from windows. Word spread quickly, as it always did in Whispering Pines, and by the time they reached the church, a small crowd had gathered. Reverend Mills answered his door in his nightshirt, blinking owlishly. "Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Mercer is someone dead." "Someone is," Caleb said, "but that's not why we're here." "We need you to marry us," Lydia said. "Right now." The Reverend's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. That is, don't you want to wait, plan something proper? You've both been through a traumatic experience." "Reverend," Lydia interrupted, "I've been a widow for 2.5 years. I've been pursued by a madman, had my house burned, my life threatened. I've waited long enough for propriety. Will you marry us or not?" "Well, yes, of course. Let me get dressed." 15 minutes later, they stood at the altar of the small church, morning light streaming through the windows. Mrs. Perkins had arrived still in her nightgown, but with a shawl thrown over it to stand as witness. Old Pete was there too, grinning his gap-toothed grin, and Clarence looking excited and confused in equal measure. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mills began, clearly flustered but trying to maintain dignity. "We are gathered here this morning, this very early morning, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Caleb barely heard the words. He was too focused on Lydia's face, on the way the morning light caught in her hair, on the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her nervousness. This was insane. They both knew it was insane. But sometimes insanity was the only sane response to an insane world. "Do you, Caleb, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse? Until death do you part." Death. They'd both seen enough of that, but also life. For the first time in 6 years, Caleb felt truly alive. "I do." "And do you, Lydia, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" She squeezed his hands, her eyes never leaving his. "I do." "The rings?" They had no rings, of course, but Mrs. Perkins stepped forward, pulling off a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," she said, pressing it into Caleb's hand. "She'd want it to go to good use." Caleb slipped it onto Lydia's finger. It fit perfectly. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and the Lord God Almighty, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." This kiss was different from the one at the stable. This was public official, a declaration before God and the town that they were bound together. When they parted, the small congregation applauded, and Caleb heard someone outside shouting the news to others. "Well, Mrs. Mercer," he said quietly, "what now?" "Now, Mr. Mercer, you take me home." They left within the hour, Lydia riding behind Caleb on Buttercup, her arms around his waist, a small bag of salvaged possessions tied to the saddle. The town turned out to see them off, some calling congratulations, others just watching in stunned silence. Judge Tillman stood on his porch looking older and smaller than before, but he tipped his hat as they passed. At the edge of town, Lydia asked him to stop. She looked back at Whispering Pines, at the place that had been her home, her refuge, and her prison. "Regrets already?" Caleb asked. "No, just saying goodbye." She tightened her arms around him. "Take me to Devil's Canyon, husband. Show me this life you've built." They rode north as the sun climbed higher toward the mountains and the canyon and the ranch where Caleb had hidden from the world for so long. But he wasn't hiding anymore. For better or worse, he'd chosen to live again. Behind them, smoke still rose from the ashes of Lydia's house. Ahead, the trail wound into unknown territory. Not the land which Caleb knew like his own hands, but the territory of two damaged people trying to build something from the ruins of their separate griefs. "Caleb," Lydia said as they entered the foothills. "Yeah. What if this doesn't work? What if we're making a terrible mistake?" He considered the question, feeling the weight of her against his back, the warmth of her arms around him. "Then we'll have made it together. That's got to count for something." She was quiet for a moment, then laughed, not bitter this time, but genuinely amused. That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Don't get used to it. I'm not good with words. Good thing I am, then. One of us has to be able to talk our way out of trouble. And the other shoots their way out, apparently. They rode on two people who'd found each other in violence and bound themselves together in desperate hope, heading toward a future neither could predict. The sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, that seemed like enough. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Caleb felt Lydia relax against him, her breathing matching the rhythm of Buttercup's gait. She'd asked him, what if it didn't work? But what if it did? What if two broken people could make something whole? What if loneliness shared became something else entirely? He thought about his empty ranch house, soon to have another person in it. Thought about the silence that would now be broken by conversation, by laughter, maybe even by arguments. It terrified him. It thrilled him. It made him feel more alive than he'd felt since Margaret died. Tell me about the ranch, Lydia said, her voice drowsy. She'd been up all night too, he realized. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. It's nothing fancy. Log cabin, 2 rooms and a loft, barn for the horses and equipment, good water from a spring that never runs dry, meadow for grazing, mountains all around for protection from the worst of the weather. Sounds perfect. It's isolated. Good. Hard work. I'm not afraid of work. Cold in winter. Then we'll have to keep each other warm. The implications of that statement hung between them, and Caleb felt heat rise in his face. They were married legally and spiritually, but they were still strangers in so many ways. We'll take it slow, he said. Figure things out as we go. Caleb Mercer, we just got married 3 hours after I proposed. I don't think slow is in our vocabulary anymore. He laughed, surprising himself. When was the last time he'd laughed? Really laughed. Not just a bitter chuckle at the ironies of life. What's funny? Just thinking how I came to town for flour and coffee. And you're leaving with a wife. That's quite a shopping trip. Most expensive flour I ever bought. She pinched his side playfully. Are you saying I'm not worth it? Ask me in a year. A year? You think we'll last that long? Why not? We've made it 3 days without killing each other. You killed Frank. That was different. Yes, she said softly. It was. Thank you for that. For killing a man. For being willing to. For standing up when no one else would. For giving me my freedom. You always had your freedom. You just needed someone to remind Frank of that fact. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the trail winding higher, the air growing thinner and cleaner. Caleb pointed out landmarks as they went, the lightning-struck pine that marked the halfway point, the creek where he'd once fought off a mountain lion, the meadow where wild mustangs sometimes grazed. It's beautiful, Lydia murmured. It's harsh. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, he agreed, thinking of her. They're not. By the time they reached Devil's Canyon, the sun was past its zenith, starting its descent toward the western peaks. The canyon opened before them like a secret walls of red rock rising on either side, a river running through the bottom green grass, and cottonwoods creating an oasis in the harsh landscape. And there, nestled against the northern wall, was his ranch, their ranch now. Oh, Caleb, Lydia breathed. It's perfect. He looked at it through her eyes, trying to see past his own familiarity. The cabin was small but solid, built to last. The barn was well-maintained, tools and equipment organized precisely. Smoke drifted from the chimney he'd banked the fire before leaving, and it had kept burning. It's home, he said simply. Yes, she agreed. It is. He helped her down from Buttercup, and she stood for a moment stretching, taking it all in. Then she walked to the cabin, ran her hand along the log walls, peered through the windows. You built this. Every log, every nail. Why here? Why this place? He looked around at the canyon that had been his refuge for 6 years. Because it's defendable. One way in, one way out. Good sightlines in all directions. Watergrass shelter. A man could hold off an army from here if he had to. Is that what you were planning, to hold off the world? Maybe. She turned to him, her expression serious. The world has a way of finding us no matter where we hide. It found me in town. No, you have found it. You made a choice to step out of your isolation, even if just for supplies. And then you made another choice to help me. And another to stay and fight. And another to marry me. She moved closer. So the question is, what choice will you make now? He knew what she was asking. Would he retreat back into his shell, keeping her at arm's length, even though she was his wife? Or would he truly let her into his home, his life? Maybe eventually his heart. Instead of answering with words, he took her hand and led her to the cabin door. Welcome home, Mrs. Mercer. The inside was Spartan but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a rough table and 2 chairs, a kitchen area with a wood stove. A door led to what must be the bedroom. A ladder led to the loft. It needs work, he said suddenly, seeing all the lacks. Curtains, more furniture, woman's touches. It needs life, she corrected, and that's what we'll give it. She moved through the space, touching things, his few books on a shelf, the rifle above the fireplace, a carved wooden horse that he'd whittled during long winter nights. Did you make this? Passes the time. It's beautiful. You're an artist. I'm a rancher. Why can't you be both? He didn't have an answer for that. In his mind, he'd always been one thing, soldier, then scout, then rancher. The idea that he could be multiple things, contain multiple possibilities, was foreign. I should see to Buttercup, he said, needing space to think. Get her unsaddled, fed. I'll make coffee, Lydia offered. If you show me where things are. He pointed out the supplies, the water barrel, how to work the stove's damper. Their fingers brushed as he handed her the coffee pot, and they both froze for a moment. This is strange, she said quietly. Very strange. But not bad strange. No, not bad. In the barn, Caleb took his time with Buttercup, brushing her coat until it shone, checking her hooves, giving her extra oats. The familiar routine calmed him, helped him process the monumental changes of the last few hours. He was married to a woman he'd known for 3 days, a woman who'd proposed to him for protection for practical reasons, but also a woman whose kiss had set something aflame in him that he'd thought was dead forever. What have I done, girl? He asked Buttercup. She snorted and nudged him with her nose, seeming to say it was about time he did something besides work and brood. When he returned to the cabin, the smell of coffee filled the air, and Lydia had found his stores putting together a simple meal of beans and biscuit. She'd also unpacked her few salvaged belongings, the books lined up on his shelf, looking like they belonged there. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing at the books. It's your home too now. They ate in companionable silence, the reality of their situation settling over them like dust. As the sun set, painting the canyon walls red and gold, the temperature dropped, and Caleb built up the fire. So, Lydia said finally, how does this work? This marriage of practicality? I don't know. How do you want it to work? She considered this, staring into the flames. I suppose we figure it out as we go. Be partners first, see what develops. And tonight, the question hung between them, loaded with possibility and uncertainty. Tonight, she said carefully, we're both exhausted. We've been through trauma. We've made a massive decision. Maybe tonight we just sleep. The bed's yours. I'll take the loft. Caleb. It's fine. We've got time to figure out the rest. She looked relieved and maybe a little disappointed. Thank you for understanding. Nothing to understand. We're both trying to find our way through something neither of us expected. Later, as he lay in the loft listening to her move around in the bedroom below, Caleb stared at the ceiling and wondered what tomorrow would bring. He'd started this week expecting nothing more than a supply run. Now he had a wife, had killed a man, had changed the course of an entire town's history. Caleb? Her voice drifted up from below. Yeah, I'm glad it was you. If I had to bind my life to someone for protection, I'm glad it was you. Even though I'm violent, even though I bring death. Because you're violent when violence is needed. Because you bring death to those who deserve it. But also because I think there's more to you than that. I think there's gentleness. You've buried creativity. You've stifled love. You've locked away. That's a lot of thinking about someone you barely know. Then I guess we'll find out if I'm right, He heard her settle into bed, the ropes creaking under the mattress. Soon her breathing evened out into sleep. But Caleb lay awake for hours, watching the stars through the small loft window, wondering if he could be the man she seemed to think he was, wondering if she could be the woman who finally made him want to try. The first light of dawn crept through the loft window, painting golden lines across the rough wooden floor. Caleb woke, as he always did, instantly alert hand reaching for the gun that wasn't there, because for the first time in 6 years, he wasn't alone in his home. The events of yesterday rushed back: the gunfight, the marriage, the ride home with Lydia's arms around him. He heard movement below the soft pad of bare feet on wood, the scrape of the stove door opening. His wife was making coffee. His wife. The words still felt foreign in his mind, like trying on clothes that didn't quite fit. Caleb descended the ladder quietly, but she heard him anyway, turning with a small smile. She'd wrapped herself in a shawl against the morning chill, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said. "Ranch habits. Always up before the sun. Even when you've been up all night fighting gun battles and getting married. Especially then, coffee smells good." She poured him a cup, their fingers brushing as she handed it over. That simple touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he saw her feel it too, color rising in her cheeks. "I've been thinking," she said, turning back to the stove, "about practical matters, such as money, for one. I have nothing. My teaching salary died with my contract, and everything else went up in flames with the house. I have money, not a fortune, but enough. Good year for cattle prices, and I've been saving." "For what?" He shrugged. "Never knew. Just seemed smart to have something put aside. And now it's ours. The ranch, the cattle, the money in the bank in Cheyenne. We're married, Lydia. What's mine is yours." She turned to face him fully, and he saw tears threatening. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. This only works if we're true partners. Equal stakes, equal say. But I'm bringing nothing to this partnership. Aren't you?" He set down his coffee, moved closer. "You're bringing intelligence, education, courage. You're bringing life to a place that's been dead for too long. That's worth more than money." "Pretty words, Mr. Mercer. Have you been practicing?" "Maybe I've been inspired." They stood there close enough to touch, but not touching the morning air charged between them. Finally, Lydia broke the moment, turning back to the stove. "You need supplies," she said. "Real supplies this time, not just flour and coffee. This cabin needs things if it's going to be a home. Cloth for curtains, proper dishes, more blankets, preserving jars for putting up food. Make a list. I'll ride to town." He stopped. Town meant Whispering Pines, meant facing the aftermath of Frank's death, meant leaving Lydia alone and vulnerable. "We'll go together," she said, reading his hesitation. "I need to collect what's salvageable from my house anyway, and formally resign from the school, and—" She paused. "We should probably let people see us together. Establish the reality of this marriage. People will talk. People are already talking. Might as well give them something accurate to say." After breakfast, they saddled 2 horses, Buttercup and a gentle mare named Sage that Caleb had been training. Lydia sat the horse, well comfortable in the saddle, in a way that spoke of experience. "You ride like someone who's done it all their life," he observed. "I grew up on a farm in Illinois. Rode before I could properly walk. It's one of the things I missed most living in town." Another piece of her revealed another layer to this woman he'd married. They rode side by side down the canyon trail, and Caleb found himself stealing glances at her, the way the morning sun caught in her hair, the determined set of her jaw, the graceful way she moved with the horse. "You're staring," she said without looking at him. "Just trying to figure you out. Any luck?" "And not yet." "Good. I'd hate to be easily solved." They were halfway to town when they heard horses approaching fast. Caleb's hand went to his gun, pushing Lydia behind him, but the riders who came into view weren't threats. It was Sheriff Tillman, former Sheriff Tillman, and 2 other men Caleb didn't recognize. "Mercer," the former sheriff said, reining in. Mrs. Mercer, heard about the wedding. Congratulations." "What do you want?" Caleb kept his tone neutral, but his hand near his weapon. "Wanted you to know there's been developments. My uncle Judge Tillman had a stroke last night. Doctor says he'll live, but won't be serving as judge anymore. The territorial governor is sending a replacement, should be here within the week. I'm sorry to hear about your uncle, Lydia said, and seemed to mean it. He's been carrying the weight of the family's sins for too long, the former sheriff said. Frank's death, it broke something in him, made him see what we'd become. He looked at Caleb directly. You did us a favor killing Frank. None of us had the courage to stop him, but somebody needed to. Doesn't mean your family won't want revenge. Some might, but most are just relieved. Frank was dragging the Tillman name through the mud. We want to rebuild, make something better. Which brings me to my point, the town needs a sheriff. A real one this time, not a Tillman puppet. You offering me the job? Caleb asked incredulously. God, no. You'd be terrible at it. All that shooting first, asking questions later. Despite everything, there was humor in his voice. But that friend of yours, old Pete, he was a lawman once. Colorado, I heard. Town council's thinking of asking him. Pete's older than dirt. But he's honest, and he's got no connection to the old power structure. Sometimes that's more important than youth. The former sheriff touched his hat brim. Just wanted you to know about my uncle, about the town. Things are changing, and mostly that's because of what you started. I didn't start anything. I just finished it. Sometimes that's the same thing. They parted ways, and Caleb and Lydia continued toward town. She was quiet for a long stretch, then said, That was unexpected. The Tillmans without Frank might actually be decent people, or they might just be biding their time. That too. Whispering Pines looked different in the morning light, cleaner somehow, as if Frank's death had washed away a layer of grime. People walked with their heads up, met each other's eyes, talked openly on the street corners. When they saw Caleb and Lydia riding in together, some waved, others called congratulations, and a few just stared in amazement. Their first stop was the bank. Morrison greeted them warmly, producing papers for Lydia to sign that officially cleared her debt. I've also taken the liberty of setting up an account in both your names, he said. Joint ownership, equal access. Modern arrangement for a modern couple. We're hardly modern, Lydia protested. A woman who proposes marriage and a man who accepts, that's as modern as it gets out here. Their next stop was what remained of Lydia's house. The fire had been controlled before it consumed everything, but the damage was extensive. The structure still stood, but the interior was gutted black with soot reeking of smoke and ruin. Lydia stood in what had been her parlor, where just 2 nights ago Frank had destroyed everything while she watched. Thomas would have been heartbroken, she said quietly. He loved this house. We picked it out together, painted it together, made it ours. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was never really mine after he died. It was just a place I existed waiting for life to start again. She looked at him. Maybe it finally has. They salvaged what they could, some dishes that had survived in a cabinet, clothes from a wardrobe that the fire hadn't reached, photographs in metal frames, and surprisingly most of her books. The ones Tommy's friend had rescued were still at the boarding house, and these had been in a trunk that protected them from the worst of the damage. Your husband must have loved books too, Caleb observed, helping her load them into saddlebags. He did, said knowledge was the only weapon that never dulled, never ran out of ammunition. She touched one leather spine gently. I used to read to him in the evenings. Poetry, mostly. He said I had a voice made for verse. You could read to me, Caleb offered, then immediately felt foolish. If you wanted. Winter evenings are long. Her smile was radiant. I'd like that. At the school, her resignation caused an uproar. Parents who'd been silent during her troubles suddenly found their voices begging her to stay. The children were worse, some crying, others angry at her perceived abandonment. You can't leave us, Mrs. Hartwell, little Sarah Morrison cried, clinging to Lydia's skirts. You're the only teacher who makes learning fun. It's Mrs. Mercer now, Lydia corrected gently, kneeling to the child's level. And I'm not abandoning you. I'm just moving to a ranch where I'll be starting a different kind of life. Will you have babies? Another child asked with the blunt curiosity of youth. Lydia's cheeks colored, and she carefully didn't look at Caleb. That's in God's hands. My ma says you married the gunfighter who killed mean Mr. Tillman, a boy piped up. She says he's dangerous. Your mother's right, Lydia said seriously. Mr. Mercer can be dangerous, but only to people who try to hurt others. To good people, kind people, he's gentle as a lamb. Caleb snorted at that description, earning a quelling look from his wife. The school board, hastily assembled, tried to convince her to stay. They offered more money, better conditions, even a new house. I appreciate the offers, Lydia said firmly, but my decision is made. My husband's ranch needs me, and frankly, I need something different. I've given this town 3 years. It's time for someone else to take over. But who? Mr. Henderson, the board president, asked desperately. Who else has your education, your patience, your way with the children? Clarence Whitmore, she said promptly. He's young but brilliant, patient, and desperately wants to be more than a banker's apprentice. Give him a chance. They left the school with Lydia carrying a box of teaching supplies, slates, chalk primers, and worn copies of readers. Might start a school at the ranch, she explained at Caleb's questioning look. There are a few families with children in the canyon area. They deserve education too. Murphy's General Store was their last stop, and this time Caleb's list was much longer than his original one. Lydia added items with the efficiency of someone used to managing a household soap and washing blue needles and thread lamp oil and wick seeds for a garden canning supplies. Planning to stay a while, Murphy asked with a grin. Planning to live, Lydia corrected. There's a difference. They were loading their purchases when a commotion arose from the saloon. A fight had broken out, not unusual, but this one spilled into the street. 2 of Frank's former hired guns were brawling with local cowboys, and it was escalating quickly. Stay here, Caleb told Lydia, but she was already moving not toward safety, but toward the fight, that teacher's authority in her voice. Gentlemen, stop this at once. Amazingly, they paused, fists still cocked but frozen by the command in her tone. Mrs. Hartwell, Mrs. Mercer, one of the cowboys stammered. These men were saying things about you and your husband, disrespectful things. The hired gun, still drunk from the night before, sneered. Just telling the truth. She married her husband's killer. What kind of woman does that? The temperature on the street seemed to drop 10 degrees. Caleb stepped forward, but Lydia held up a hand, stopping him. The kind of woman who recognizes courage when she sees it, she said, her voice carrying clearly. The kind who chooses a protector over a predator. The kind who won't be victimized by men who think might makes right. She looked at the hired guns directly. Your employer is dead because he couldn't accept that a woman had the right to say no. If you want to follow his example, that's your choice. But know that this town is done with that kind of thinking. You think you're safe because you married him, one of the gunmen slurred. He can't protect you forever. He doesn't have to. Old Pete's voice came from behind them. He stood there with the sheriff's star newly pinned to his chest, the Remington prominent on his hip. That's what the law is for now. And as the newly appointed sheriff of Whispering Pines, I'm telling you boys, you've got 1 hour to clear out. After that, you're under arrest for disturbing the peace. You can't. I can and I am. Judge Tillman's not here to protect you anymore. New judge arrives next week and he's got no patience for hired thugs. So move along, boys. Find another town to poison. The gunmen looked around, saw no support in the faces surrounding them, and slunk away muttering threats that everyone knew were empty. Sheriff Pete, Caleb asked, raising an eyebrow. Has a ring to it, doesn't it? Pete grinned. Town council voted this morning. Unanimous decision. Figured if I could survive 60 years of frontier living, I could handle a few years of keeping the peace. Congratulations, Lydia said warmly. The town couldn't have chosen better. Well, I learned from watching your husband here. Sometimes the best way to keep the peace is to be willing to break it first. As they prepared to leave town, Mrs. Perkins rushed out of the boarding house with a wrapped bundle. Wedding present, she said brusquely. Don't open it till you get home. Mrs. Perkins, you've already done so much. Hush, girl. It's not every day I get to see a romance born in my dining room. Let an old woman have her moments. The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought. The sun was high and warm, the mountains majestic around them, and Caleb found himself seeing his land through new eyes, not as a fortress against the world, but as a place where something could grow. It went better than expected, Lydia finally said. The town's changing because of you. Because of us, yeah, he corrected. You standing up to those men, that was as important as any gunfight. I was terrified. Couldn't tell. I've gotten good at hiding it. 3 years of facing down Frank Tillman teaches you to never show weakness. They reached the ranch as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. While Caleb tended the horses and unloaded supplies, Lydia organized the cabin, finding homes for their new possessions. When he came in, she'd transformed the space curtains at the windows, a tablecloth on the rough table dishes arranged on the shelf. "It looks like a home," he said, amazed. "It always was. It just needed a woman's touch to reveal it." She opened Mrs. Perkins' bundle and gasped. Inside was a quilt hand-stitched in a wedding ring pattern, obviously an heirloom. "This was her mother's," Lydia breathed. "She mentioned it once, said it was made for her mother's wedding. And now she's given it to us." "She likes you." "She likes us," Lydia corrected. "She sees something in us worth investing in." That evening they worked side by side, preparing dinner venison steak from Caleb's smokehouse biscuits that Lydia made from memory-preserved peaches they'd bought from Murphy's. It felt natural moving around each other in the small kitchen space, handing things back and forth without needing to ask. "This is nice," Lydia said as they ate by candlelight. "Better than nice." "Caleb, we need to talk about something." His stomach tightened. "About what?" "About this marriage. About expectations. About—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "Intimacy. We don't have to—" "No, we do. We're married. Legally, spiritually, publicly. But we're still strangers in many ways. I need you to know—" She took a breath. "Thomas and I, we loved each other deeply. The physical side of marriage was wonderful, natural, an expression of that love. But I can't just pretend with you. I can't fake something that profound. I'm not asking you to. But you're my husband. You have rights. I have nothing but what you choose to give me," he said firmly. "This marriage might have started as protection, as practical necessity, but I won't have it built on obligation. If we come together, it'll be because we both want it, not because a piece of paper says we should." She looked at him across the table, candlelight dancing in her eyes. "You're not what I expected, Caleb Mercer." "What did you expect?" "A brute, maybe. Someone damaged beyond repair. Someone who'd take what he wanted because he could. And instead I find a man who carves wooden horses with artist's hands, who builds homes that last, who steps between evil and innocence without hesitation. A man who accepts a desperate proposal from a desperate woman and treats her with more respect than she's known in years. You make me sound better than I am. Or maybe you've forgotten who you really are." She stood moving around the table to stand beside him. "May I?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. She reached out, tracing the scar that ran along his jaw, another on his forehead, half hidden by his hair. "So many battles," she murmured. "So many wounds. They healed. The ones on the outside, maybe." Her hand moved to rest over his heart, and he knew she could feel it racing. "Lydia, I'm not ready," she said softly. "Not for everything. But I'm ready for something. A beginning, maybe." She leaned down and kissed him, different from their previous kisses. This one was exploration, question, possibility. When she pulled back, they were both breathing unsteadily. "Will you hold me tonight?" she asked. "Just hold me. I've been alone in the dark for so long." "Yes." They prepared for bed with nervous courtesy, taking turns with privacy, maintaining modesty. But when they lay down together in the bed that had been his alone for 6 years, when she curled into his side with her head on his shoulder, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Tell me about Margaret," she said into the darkness. He tensed. "Why? Because she shaped who you became. Because losing her broke something in you that maybe can be mended." So he told her. About the wagon train, about Margaret's laugh that could light up a campfire circle, about her dreams of teaching school in California. About the attack, his freezing her screams that still haunted his dreams. About holding her as fever took her, promising he'd live enough life for both of them, then failing to keep that promise. "You didn't fail," Lydia said when he finished. "You just postponed. You're living now." You stepped between me and Frank. You didn't freeze then. That was different." "How?" He thought about it. "I don't know. It just was. I'll tell you how. With Margaret, you were 17, untested, facing your first real violence. You were a boy who thought he was a man. With me, you were actually a man, one who'd learned from his failures, who'd earned his courage through suffering. You're saying I couldn't have saved her, even if I'd tried. I'm saying you can't know that, and torturing yourself with what-ifs won't bring her back. But I think Margaret would be glad you saved me. I think she'd want you to forgive yourself. You didn't know her. No, but I know you, and the brother she loved, the one you were before grief twisted you into who you became, that's still in there. I see glimpses of him when you think I'm not looking. They lay in silence for a while, and Caleb thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she spoke again so quietly he almost missed it. Thomas was shot in the back. He stiffened. What? The official report said his wagon went off a cliff, that the horse was spooked and bolted. But I saw his body. There was a bullet hole in his back, small caliber, the kind of hideout gun Frank always carried. They shot him, pushed the wagon off the cliff to make it look like an accident. Jesus, Lydia. I tried to get justice. Went to the sheriff, the judge even wrote to the territorial governor. Nothing. The Tillmans had too much power. So I stayed teaching school, being visible, being a reminder that they couldn't drive me off. It was my own form of revenge. And now Frank's dead, and I find I don't want revenge anymore. I just want to live, to be happy again, to build something new instead of clinging to something lost. With me. With you. She tilted her head up, and he kissed her forehead gently. We'll build something good, Lydia, something that lasts. Promise. I promise. She settled back against him, and this time she did fall asleep, her breathing evening out, her body relaxing completely. Caleb lay awake holding her, marveling at the trust she showed. This woman who'd lost everything, who'd been hunted and threatened, who'd seen her husband murdered, trusted him enough to sleep defenseless in his arms. The next morning brought a thunderstorm, rain pounding the roof, turning the canyon into a symphony of water music. They couldn't work outside, so they worked within, organizing the cabin, planning improvements, talking about everything and nothing. We should build another room, Lydia suggested. For a study, or, she trailed off, or a nursery. She blushed. Eventually, maybe, if you want children. Do you? I thought I couldn't after Thomas. We tried for 2 years with no success, but maybe it was just the wrong time. Or the wrong circumstances. Hard to create life when you're surrounded by so much death. Exactly. The storm passed by afternoon, leaving the world washed clean. They walked together along the river, Lydia gathering plants. She recognized wild onions, sage, medicinal herbs. I want to plant a garden, she said. Vegetables, herbs, flowers too. Beauty for beauty's sake. The growing season's short up here. Then we'll make the most of it. They found a spot near the cabin, protected from wind but open to sun, with good drainage. Caleb watched her plan it out, pacing off sections, talking about corn and beans and squash, about companion planting she'd learned as a girl. You're different here, he observed. More alive. I'm free here. No watching eyes, no wagging tongues, no Frank Tillman lurking in shadows, just us and the land and possibility. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she read to him from one of her salvaged books, Wordsworth poems about nature and solitude and the human heart. Her voice was indeed made for verse, rising and falling with the rhythm of the words. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, she read. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away a sordid boon. He understood, Caleb said when she finished, the need to step away from the world. But not forever, Lydia countered. Even Wordsworth returned to society, eventually bringing with him what he'd learned in solitude. Is that what we're doing? Learning in solitude? Maybe. Or maybe we're healing, two damaged people finding wholeness together. As the days passed, they developed rhythms, morning coffee, watching sunrise paint the canyon walls, working side by side on ranch tasks, evening meals that stretched into long conversations, nights curled together, learning the comfort of shared warmth. The physical attraction grew slowly but steadily. A brush of hands became a held hand. A kiss on the forehead became a kiss on the lips. Lying close became lying entwined. Neither pushed, both waited. Let nature take its course, like water finding its level. One night, 2 weeks after their wedding, Lydia turned to him in bed with purpose in her eyes. "Caleb, yes, I'm ready. Are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, she kissed him with a passion that had been building since that first day in Whispering Pines. What followed was gentle and fierce by turns, two people discovering each other mapping scars, both physical and emotional, finding healing in the joining. Afterward, they lay breathless sweat cooling in the night air. "That was," Lydia began. "Different," he finished. "Different from what I expected." "Better or worse?" "Better, so much better. Like the difference between surviving and living." She laughed, the sound filling the cabin with joy. "We're quite a pair, aren't we, the gunfighter and the schoolmarm hiding out in Devil's Canyon?" "Not hiding," he corrected. "Building, creating, living." A week later, unexpected visitors arrived. A small wagon wound its way up the canyon trail, carrying Mr. and Mrs. Morrison from town, Clarence Mrs. Perkins, and surprisingly the former Sheriff Tillman. "Hope you don't mind," Mrs. Perkins called out. "We wanted to see how you were settling in, bring some supplies, make sure you hadn't killed each other yet." "Still alive?" Lydia laughed, embracing the older woman. "Both of us." They'd brought gifts, preserves, and pickles from Mrs. Perkins' books, from Clarence tools, from Morrison, and from the former sheriff, a document that made Caleb's eyebrows rise. "Deed transfer," Tillman explained. "That patch of land that borders your ranch to the south. Frank bought it years ago, planned to squeeze you out eventually. Figure it belongs to you now, compensation for the trouble he caused." "I can't accept this," Caleb protested. "You can and you will. It's good land water rights included. Besides, the Tillman family owes a debt. This is partial payment." They stayed for dinner, the cabin filled with laughter and conversation. Clarence was indeed teaching school, doing well despite his youth. Pete was keeping the peace with a combination of humor and that old Remington. The town was changing slowly but surely. "You two started something," Morrison said. "Showed people they could stand up, could change things. There's talk of starting that newspaper Thomas Hartwell wanted, bringing in new businesses, making Whispering Pines something more than the Tillmans' personal kingdom." "That's good," Lydia said, but Caleb heard the distance in her voice. Her life was here now, in the canyon, not in town. After the visitors left, they stood together, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Any regrets?" Caleb asked. "About which part?" "The gunfight. The marriage. The sudden change in my entire life. Any of it. All of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas once told me that life isn't about avoiding storms, but learning to dance in the rain. I loved him for that wisdom, but I never understood it until now. And now I'm dancing." She took his hand, pulled him into an impromptu waltz there in the yard, humming a tune he didn't recognize. They turned and swayed, laughing at their own foolishness, while the stars came out overhead and the canyon walls echoed their joy. "I love you," she said, suddenly stopping mid-turn. "I didn't expect to, didn't think I could again, but I do. Not the same as with Thomas, that was young love untested. This is something else, deeper, earned." "Lydia, you don't have to say it back. I know you're still learning how, but I needed you to know." He pulled her close, buried his face in her hair. "I don't have the words yet, but I feel it. This thing between us. It's more than gratitude, more than attraction. It's love, Caleb. Complicated, unexpected, but love all the same." That night, their lovemaking had a different quality, less desperate, more certain. They knew each other now, trusted each other, had chosen each other, not in a moment of crisis, but in the quiet, ordinary days that followed. A month after the wedding, Lydia suspected she was pregnant. 2 months after, she was certain. "A baby," she whispered, hand on her still flat stomach. "After all this time, a baby." Caleb was terrified and elated in equal measure. "What if something happens? What if I can't protect—" "Stop." She put her fingers over his lips. "We can't live in fear of what might happen. We can only live in joy of what is happening. We're having a baby, Caleb, a new life from two people who thought their lives were over." They adjusted their plans. The extra room became definitely a nursery. Trips to town. Included stops at the doctor, and Caleb found himself working with renewed purpose, expanding the ranch not just for survival, but for a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. The pregnancy progressed well. Lydia bloomed, her energy seemingly endless despite morning sickness and the challenges of ranch life. She started her school teaching a handful of canyon children 3 days a week. She planted her garden and watched it grow. She read to Caleb every evening and sang to their unborn child when she thought he wasn't listening. "You're happy," he said one evening, watching her shell peas they'd grown themselves. "I am. Happier than I ever thought I'd be again. Are you?" He considered the question. 6 months ago, he'd been alone, purposeless beyond mere survival. Now he had a wife, a child coming, a ranch that was becoming a real home, connections to a community that had embraced them. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm happy. Even though you came to town just for flour and coffee. Especially because of that. If I'd gotten what I planned, I'd have missed what I needed." Winter came early that year, blanketing the canyon in snow by November. But the cabin was warm, filled with the smell of bread baking, the sound of Lydia's laughter, the quiet contentment of two people who'd found each other against all odds. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Lydia asked, "Do you think Margaret would approve of us, of this life?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I think she'd be glad I stopped punishing myself. She always said I was too hard on myself even as a boy. She sounds wise." She was 17, but yes, wise beyond her years. He pulled Lydia closer. "She would have liked you. You both have that same strength, that refusal to let the world break you." "The world broke me plenty, but I got back up." "That's what I mean. That's real strength." As Lydia's pregnancy advanced, the community rallied around them. Mrs. Perkins sent baby clothes she'd been saving for the right couple. Morrison's wife, who they'd barely met, arrived with a cradle Morrison had made. Even the former Sheriff Tillman sent a gift, a savings bond for the baby's education. "We've become the couple everyone's rooting for," Lydia observed, amused. "Because we're proof that things can change," Caleb replied. "That people can start over, that good can come from bad. Are we really that symbolic?" In a frontier town starved for hope, yes. The baby came in spring as the canyon burst into bloom, a difficult labor that terrified Caleb more than any gunfight. But Lydia was strong, the midwife skilled, and when their son's first cry echoed off the canyon walls, Caleb wept, for the first time since Margaret's death. "He's perfect," Lydia whispered, exhausted but radiant. "What should we name him?" Caleb looked at his son, red-faced, squalling, absolutely perfect, and said, "Thomas. Thomas James Mercer." Lydia's tears fell freely, after both men who shaped our lives. Perfect. As Caleb held his son for the first time, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. A simple supply run that became a gunfight, a practical marriage proposal that became real love, two broken people who'd found wholeness in each other. "Thank you," he told Lydia. "For what?" "For proposing. For being brave enough to ask a stranger to marry you. For seeing something in me worth saving." "Thank you," she replied, "for saying yes. For being the kind of man who would. For giving me a life worth living." Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and nourishing. Inside, a new family lay together, father, mother, and child, proof that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to exactly where we need to be. The sunset painted the canyon walls gold and red, the same colors they'd been the day Caleb brought Lydia home. But everything else had changed. The silent cabin now rang with life. The solitary rancher now had a family. The grieving widow had found joy again. And somewhere perhaps Margaret and Thomas looked down and smiled, knowing their loved ones had found their way through grief to something beautiful and lasting and real. Little Thomas was 3 months old when the trouble started again. Caleb had been expecting it. Peace never lasted long on the frontier, and the Tillman family's power, while diminished, wasn't completely broken. The first sign came in the form of missing cattle, just a few head at first, then more. Tracks led toward the southern boundary, the land the former sheriff had deeded to them. "Could be rustlers," Caleb said, examining the tracks in the morning light while Lydia held the baby who was fussing in the cool air. "Or could be Tillmans testing us," she replied. seeing if you've gone soft with domesticity." He looked at his wife standing there with their son in her arms, rifle propped against the fence post within easy reach. 6 months of marriage had only made her stronger, more confident. Ranch life agreed with her. Sun had bronzed her skin, work had strengthened her body, and motherhood had given her a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of a mountain cat defending her cubs. "Have I," he asked, "gone soft?" She smiled, that particular smile that still made his heart race. "You're gentler, yes, but soft, no. I've seen you practice with that colt every morning. You're faster than ever." "Speed doesn't matter if you hesitate." "You won't hesitate. Not when it matters." That night they heard horses approaching. Caleb was up and armed before the sound fully registered, moving to the window, while Lydia took position by the door, the baby secured in his cradle in the back room. "Mercer," a voice called out. "Caleb Mercer. We need to talk." Caleb recognized the voice, Jim Tillman, Frank's younger brother. He'd been away at college back east when Frank died, but had returned recently full of education and, according to rumors, ideas about reclaiming the family's prominence. "State your business, Tillman," Caleb called back. "Just want to talk civilized-like. I'm not my brother Mercer. I've got a proposition that might interest you." Caleb looked at Lydia, who nodded slightly. They'd discussed this possibility, knew it would come eventually. The question was whether Jim Tillman was more like his dead brother or his uncle, the former judge who'd finally seen the damage their family had wrought. "You can come to the door," Caleb said. Slowly, hands visible. Jim Tillman appeared in the doorway's light, and Caleb was struck by how different he looked from Frank, leaner, younger, with intelligent eyes that held calculation rather than cruelty. He was well-dressed, but practically so, not the flashy style Frank had favored. "Mrs. Mercer," Jim said, touching his hat brim politely. "I heard congratulations are in order. A son, I believe." "What do you want?" Lydia's voice was cold. "Direct. I like that." "Very well, I want to buy your ranch." The silence stretched out, broken only by the pop of wood in the fireplace. "Not for sale," Caleb said finally. "Everything's for sale at the right price. I'm offering 3 times what the land is worth. Enough to set you up anywhere in the territory, comfortable for life." "Why?" Lydia asked. "Why this land?" Jim smiled, and there was something of Frank in that expression. "Because there's silver in these mountains, Mrs. Mercer. A substantial vein, according to the surveyor I hired. Your canyon sits right on top of it." Caleb felt Lydia's hand find his in the darkness. Silver meant mining operations, meant the end of their peaceful life, meant fortune hunters and claim jumpers, and industrial machinery tearing apart their land. "Still not for sale," Caleb said. "I thought you might say that. So here's the thing. I've been buying up the lands around you, the water rights upstream. The only trail in and out of the canyon passes through what's now my property. I can make your life very difficult. Your brother tried that. It didn't end well for him. My brother was a fool who thought with his fists and his pride. I think with my head. I don't want violence, Mercer. I want a business transaction. And if we refuse," Jim shrugged, "then you'll find ranching becomes unprofitable. Cattle need water. Families need supplies. Both become expensive when you have to negotiate for access." From the back room came the sound of Thomas crying. Lydia started to move, but Caleb stopped her with a gentle touch. "I'll go," he said, keeping his eyes on Jim. "Don't move until I get back." He found his son red-faced and angry at being awakened. Caleb picked him up, felt the tiny body settle against his chest, the cries diminishing to whimpers. He stood there for a moment holding his child, thinking about the future Jim Tillman was threatening. When he returned, still carrying Thomas, Jim's expression had changed. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or recalculation. "Fine-looking boy," Jim said quietly. "He is. You want him to grow up here isolated, struggling to make ends meet while sitting on a fortune. I want him to grow up knowing his father didn't sell out the first time someone waved money at him," Caleb replied. "I want him to know that some things matter more than wealth." Jim studied them, Caleb holding the baby. Lydia standing strong beside them, rifle now openly in her hands. "You know I could take this to court," Jim said. "Challenge the deed my cousin gave you. Claim undue influence, mental incompetence on his part. You could try, Lydia said, but the new judge isn't a Tillman, and the whole town witnessed your cousin's sound mind when he made that transfer. The town, Jim said softly. Yes, you've won them over, haven't you? The gunfighter and the schoolmarm, the fairy tale couple who stood up to evil Frank. But fairy tales end, Mrs. Mercer, and real life has a way of grinding down heroes. Is that a threat? Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. It's observation. Think about my offer, for your family's sake. After Jim left, they stood together in the doorway, watching his riders disappear into the darkness. Silver, Lydia said. There's silver in our mountains. Apparently, that changes everything. Does it? We didn't know about it this morning, and we were happy. Why should knowing change that? She took Thomas from him, cradling their son close. Because now others know, and they won't stop coming. She was right. Over the next weeks, they had more visitors than in all the previous months combined. Prospectors accidentally straying onto their land. Investors from Denver and Cheyenne offering to partner with them. Even a government surveyor claiming eminent domain might apply if the silver deposits were substantial enough. Through it all, Caleb and Lydia held firm. This was their land, their home, their son's inheritance. But the pressure was taking its toll. Caleb spent more time riding the boundaries, checking for intruders. Lydia kept the rifle closer, even when teaching the canyon children who still came for lessons 3 days a week. The situation exploded on a hot July afternoon. Caleb had ridden to the southern boundary to check on missing cattle when he heard gunshots from the direction of home. He spurred Buttercup hard, racing back through the canyon, fear clenching his chest like a fist. He found chaos. Armed men surrounded the cabin, not Jim's men, but rougher types claimed jumpers by their look. Lydia was barricaded inside with Thomas and her 3 students who'd been there for lessons. She was returning fire from the windows, keeping the attackers at bay, but she was outnumbered 6-1. Caleb didn't hesitate. He came in from behind the attackers using the barn for cover. His first shot took one in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second dropped another who was trying to torch the chicken coop. The element of surprise was his, but it wouldn't last long. "It's Mercer," one of them shouted. "The gunfighter!" That gave them pause, these men who thought they were attacking a woman alone. Caleb used their hesitation moving position, making them think he had backup. "You're on my land," he called out. "Shrei, leave now or I start aiming to kill." "This land's got silver," one shouted back. "That makes it open for claiming." "Only if we're dead," Caleb replied. "And my wife and I are very much alive. Plus she's protecting children in there. You fire on that cabin, you're child killers. That's a hanging offense even out here." The attackers looked at each other, suddenly less certain. Attacking an isolated ranch for silver was one thing. Murdering children was another. "Jim Tillman said," one began. "Jim Tillman's using you as cannon fodder." Lydia's voice rang out from the cabin. "Did he tell you my husband killed his brother? Did he mention Caleb spent 3 years fighting Apache? You think you're the first men to try taking what's ours." The psychological warfare worked. The wounded men were moaning, begging for help. The others were realizing this wasn't the easy score they'd been promised. "We're leaving," their apparent leader finally said. "But this ain't over. There's silver here, and silver draws men like honey draws flies." They retreated, taking their wounded, leaving Caleb and Lydia to check on the terrified children huddled in the cabin. "Is everyone all right?" Caleb asked, dropping to his knees beside them. Sarah Morrison, the same little girl who'd clung to Lydia at the school, nodded bravely. "Mrs. Mercer protected us. She said you'd come, and you did. Always." He promised, meeting Lydia's eyes over the children's heads. "I'll always come." That evening, after the children had been safely returned to their families with stories that would make Caleb and Lydia legends, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "We can't keep this up," Lydia said quietly. Thomas sleeping in her arms, fighting off every claim jumper, every get-rich-quick schemer. "What are you suggesting?" "Maybe we should consider Jim's offer. Take the money, start over somewhere else." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" "I want our son to grow up safe. I want to not jump at every strange sound. I want peace, Caleb." "And you think running will give us that, wouldn't it?" He stood, walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the canyon that had been his refuge, his fortress, his home. I ran here 6 years ago, ran from the guilt of not saving Margaret from the world that reminded me of my failure. And what did it get me? Loneliness, emptiness, a half-life. That's different. Is it? We'd be running from trouble, yes, but also from the life we've built, the land we've worked, the home where our son was born. And what would we be teaching him that when things get hard, you quit? Lydia stood joining him. Thomas still in her arms. Then what do? We fight, but not alone this time. The next morning, Caleb rode to town with a purpose. He found Sheriff Pete first, then Morrison at the bank, then Clarence at the school. By noon, he'd gathered a dozen men in Mrs. Perkins' dining room, all men who'd benefited from the change Caleb and Lydia had brought to Whispering Pines. You've all heard about the silver, Caleb began, and the trouble it's bringing. Jim Tillman's been spreading word far and wide, Pete confirmed, trying to force your hand. Well, I've got a proposition of my own. The silver's there, no denying it, but it doesn't have to destroy our life or the canyon. What if we formed a Company A cooperative? Local investors, only people we trust. We mine responsibly, share the profits, keep outsiders from destroying everything. Morrison leaned forward, interested. You're talking about keeping control while still accessing the wealth. Exactly. Jim Tillman wants to buy us out strip mine, the canyon destroy everything for quick profit. But if we control the operation, we can do it right. Preserve the ranch, protect the water, make sure the canyon remains livable. And if Jim doesn't accept this, Clarence asked, then we make him. Legally, financially, whatever it takes. But I'm done being reactive. It's time to take control. The meeting lasted hours, plans forming, alliances building. By the time Caleb rode home, he had commitments for investment, legal support, and most importantly, community backing. He found Lydia in the garden, Thomas playing on a blanket beside her as she tended her vegetables. The sight still took his breath away. This woman who'd chosen him, this child, they'd created this life they'd built. How did it go? She asked, reading his expression. We're not alone anymore. The town's with us. She stood dusting soil from her hands. Really? Really? Morrison's putting together the financing. Pete's organizing security. Clarence is researching the legal precedents. We're going to beat Jim Tillman at his own game. Lydia threw her arms around him, laughing with relief. I should have known you'd find a way. We found a way. This was your idea as much as mine community working together, standing together. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Lydia said, You've changed so much since that first day in town. Have I? The man who rode in for supplies would never have thought to ask for help to build alliances to trust others. You'd have tried to handle everything alone. That man was an idiot. No, he was wounded, but he healed. She touched his face gently. We healed each other. The confrontation with Jim Tillman came 2 days later. He arrived with lawyers and gunmen paperwork and threats expecting to find desperate homesteaders ready to capitulate. Instead, he found Caleb and Lydia on their porch, backed by a dozen armed townsmen and Morrison with legal documents of their own. What is this? Jim demanded. This is the Canyon Silver Cooperative, Morrison announced, legally incorporated with mineral rights leased from the Mercers for responsible extraction. You want silver from this canyon. You deal with us. Jim's face flushed. You can't do this. Already done? Clarence said, holding up the paperwork. Filed with the territorial government yesterday. Completely legal and binding. I'll fight this in court. You're welcome to try, Sheriff Pete said amiably. Of course, the new judge is mighty interested in how you've been hiring claim jumpers to terrorize families. Might not look kindly on your case. Jim looked around at the assembled group townspeople who'd once cowered before the Tillman name, now standing firm. His eyes finally settled on Caleb. You think you've won? I think we've chosen to stand together instead of being picked off separately. Your family ruled through division and fear. We're choosing unity and courage. Pretty words for a gunfighter. I'm not just a gunfighter anymore. Haven't been since the day I married Lydia. I'm a husband, a father, a rancher, a member of this community, and we protect what's ours. Jim stood there for a long moment, calculation in his eyes. Then surprisingly, he smiled. My uncle was right. He said you were different, that you couldn't be bought or bullied. I didn't believe him. Your uncle's a wise man. Wiser than the rest of us, apparently. Jim looked at Morrison. What are the terms for outside investment in this cooperative? The question surprised everyone. Morrison recovered first. You want to invest? The Tillman family fortune was built on cattle and intimidation. Both are dying industries. Mining's the future, and you're offering a chance to be part of it legitimately. So yes, I want to invest, if you'll have me. Caleb looked at Lydia, who gave a slight nod. We'll consider it, but understand you invest as an equal partner, not as a Tillman expecting special treatment. Understood. It took months to work out the details, but eventually the Canyon Silver Cooperative began operations. True to their plan, it was responsible mining. No massive environmental destruction, no company towns full of desperate workers. The profits were good but not obscene, shared among the investors and used to improve the town and surrounding ranches. Caleb and Lydia's life found a new rhythm. The ranch remained their primary focus, but the mining income meant they could improve it: a larger house with proper rooms, a better barn fencing that actually kept cattle where they belonged. They hired help, young men looking to learn ranching, giving them the same chance Caleb had once taken for himself. Thomas grew strong and curious, toddling around the ranch with the confidence of a child who'd never known fear or want. Lydia continued teaching now in a proper schoolhouse they'd built near the ranch, serving not just the Canyon children, but those from neighboring valleys, too. One evening, as 3-year-old Thomas played with the wooden horses Caleb had carved for him, Lydia made an announcement. I'm pregnant again. Caleb nearly dropped the saddle he was repairing. We're having another baby? Yes. He crossed to her, lifting her in his arms, spinning her around while she laughed. Thomas clapped his hands, delighted by his parents' joy, even if he didn't understand the cause. When winter, the doctor thinks. December, maybe January. A Christmas baby. Maybe. Would you like that? I'd like any baby that's ours. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps, because they were easier with each other settled into their love. The Canyon community rallied around them again, and when little Margaret was born on a snowy December night, it seemed half the territory celebrated. You named her after your sister, Lydia said, exhausted but glowing as she held their daughter. If that's all right. It's perfect. A way to honor the past while building the future. As Caleb held his daughter for the first time, with his son peering curiously at his new sister and his wife smiling at them all, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. 5 years ago, he'd ridden to town for simple supplies. Now he had a family, a community, a purpose beyond mere survival. No regrets? Lydia asked, echoing his question from years before. Not one. Even though you just wanted flour and coffee. Especially because of that, if I'd gotten only what I thought I wanted, I'd have missed everything I actually needed. The years rolled on, bringing challenges and joys in equal measure. The Canyon Silver Cooperative became a model for responsible mining throughout the territory. Whispering Pines grew into a proper town with businesses and schools, and even the newspaper Thomas Hartwell had once dreamed of starting. Jim Tillman surprisingly became a friend of sorts. He never fully shed his family's ambition, but he channeled it into legitimate business, eventually marrying Clarence's sister and settling into respectable life. The old judge passed quietly one winter, and at his funeral, the whole town turned out not to mourn the tyrant he'd enabled, but to acknowledge the man he'd tried to become at the end. Sheriff Pete served for 10 more years before retiring, passing the badge to a younger man he'd trained. But he remained a fixture in town, telling stories at Mrs. Perkins' boarding house, his tales growing more elaborate with each passing year. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man, combining his father's courage with his mother's intelligence. He went east for college, the first in the family to do so, but returned to the ranch bringing new ideas about land management and conservation. Margaret became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over the Canyon School, filling it with the same joy of learning Lydia had brought. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Caleb and Lydia stood on the same porch, where they'd made their stand against claim jumpers, where they decided to fight for their land and life together. Did you ever imagine this? Lydia asked, leaning against him as they watched their grandchildren, Thomas's twin boys, play in the yard. Never. My imagination was never this good. Mine either. I thought my life ended when Thomas died. I was just going through the motions existing rather than living. And then, and then a cowboy rode into town for supplies. She smiled up at him. A taciturn, wounded, stubborn cowboy who changed everything. You changed everything, that proposal of yours. The desperate suggestion of a desperate woman. The bravest thing anyone's ever done for me. You saw something worth saving in a man who'd given up on himself. And you saw something worth protecting in a woman the rest of the world had abandoned. They stood in comfortable silence, the evening painting the canyon in familiar shades of gold and red. The ranch spread around them, expanded now, prosperous, but still the same heart, the same soul. I love you, Caleb said, words that came easily now after years of practice. I love you too. More than on our wedding day, more than when our children were born, more than I thought possible to love anyone. Even though I brought violence to your doorstep. Because you brought violence when violence was needed and peace when peace was possible. You brought balance, Caleb, to me, to the town, to yourself. A commotion from the yard drew their attention. Their grandson had fallen, skinned his knee, and was trying hard not to cry. Thomas, so like his father, in his quiet strength, picked the boy up, dusted him off, whispered something that made him laugh. He's a good father, Lydia observed. He learned from the best, from both of us. We showed him that broken people can heal, that love can grow from the most unlikely beginnings, that sometimes the best things in life come from taking desperate chances. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Caleb thought about that long-ago morning when he'd ridden to town for supplies. Such a simple errand that had become the pivot point of his entire existence. Caleb, Lydia said softly. If you had it to do over knowing everything that would happen, Frank, the gunfight, the fear, the struggles, would you still stop to help me that day? He turned her to face him. This woman who'd become his salvation, his partner, his love. Her hair was silver now at the temple's lines, mapped the years around her eyes, but she was more beautiful to him than on that first day. I would stop 1,000 times over. In every possible version of our lives, I would always stop. Even knowing the pain it would bring, especially knowing the joy it would bring. The pain was temporary, Lydia. This, he gestured at their home, their family, their life. This is forever. She kissed him. Then a kiss that held 20 years of shared life, of challenges overcome, of love deepened by time and trial. Grandma, Grandpa. Their granddaughter, little Sarah, came running. Mama says dinner's ready. They walked hand in hand toward the house, now filled with family. Margaret had married a good man from town, a doctor who'd set up practice in Whispering Pines. They'd come for Sunday dinner, as had become tradition, filling the house with laughter and conversation. Around the table that night, as 3 generations shared food and stories, Caleb caught Lydia's eye. She smiled that same smile that had first undone him all those years ago, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was. This was what they'd fought for. Not just the land or the silver or the respect of the town. They'd fought for this moment, family gathered safe and happy in a home built by love rather than fear. Thomas stood raising his glass. I want to propose a toast. To what? Margaret asked. To unexpected journeys, to the day Pa rode to town for flour and coffee and came back with so much more. To desperate proposals, Lydia added, her eyes twinkling. To saying yes to crazy ideas, Caleb contributed. To standing up to bullies, Margaret chimed in. To the Canyon's Silver Cooperative, someone called out, making everyone laugh. To family, little Sarah said seriously, and everyone fell quiet, smiling at the wisdom of children. To family, they echoed, glasses clinking. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Caleb and Lydia sat by the fire as they had so many nights before. She was reading not Wordsworth this time, but one of their grandchildren's primers preparing lessons. Read to me, he said as he often did. She smiled, opened a different book, their old favorite worn from years of handling. Her voice still made for verse despite the years filled the quiet room. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. And sorry I could not travel both. As she read Frost's familiar words about choices and paths taken, Caleb closed his eyes and listened. He thought about roads and choices, about the path that had led from a supply run to a gunfight, to a desperate proposal to this moment of perfect contentment. When she finished, they sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the canyon wind singing its ancient song outside. "I'm glad we took the unexpected road," Lydia said softly. "The one less traveled by, the one that led us to each other." "And that has made all the difference," he completed, quoting the poem's final line. She laughed, that sound that still filled him with joy. "You've been paying attention all these years to every word, every moment, every blessed day of this unexpected life." They climbed the stairs to their bedroom, not rushing anymore, their passion tempered by time into something deeper, more lasting. As they prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of long marriage, Caleb thought he heard something, the echo of hoofbeats from long ago, a lone rider heading to town for supplies. "What are you thinking about?" Lydia asked, noticing his distant expression. "Beginnings. How the smallest decisions can change everything. Like stopping to help a woman being harassed, like proposing to a virtual stranger, like saying yes." They lay down together, her head finding its familiar spot on his shoulder, their bodies fitting together like puzzle pieces worn smooth by time. "Caleb, yes, love. Thank you for stopping that day, for staying, for building this life with me. Thank you for asking me to, for seeing past the gunfighter to the man underneath, for never letting me retreat back into solitude. We saved each other. We did." Outside, the canyon settled into sleep, peaceful and prosperous, so different from the harsh, lonely place it had been when Caleb first arrived. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been worth every struggle. As sleep began to claim him, Caleb thought about their son Thomas, now talking about perhaps running for territorial office, continuing the work of bringing justice and progress to the frontier. About Margaret, whose teaching would shape another generation. About the grandchildren who would grow up in a world made better by the choices two desperate people had made 20 years ago. "I love you, Mrs. Mercer," he murmured into the darkness. "And I love you, Mr. Mercer, forever and always. Forever and always." Words that had seemed impossible for two wounded souls who'd thought their capacity for love had died with their first spouses. But here they were 20 years later, proof that second chances existed, that love could grow from the most practical beginnings, that sometimes the best journeys were the ones you never planned to take. The moon rose over Devil's Canyon's silver light, painting the landscape that had seen so much transformation. In the barn, horses settled for the night, including old Buttercup, gray-muzzled now, but still spirited. In the house, 3 generations slept peacefully secure in the love that bound them. And in their bed, 2 people who'd found each other in violence and bound themselves in desperation lay entwined, their breathing synchronized, their hearts beating as one. They'd built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate griefs, created a legacy of love that would outlast them both. All because one spring morning in 1875, a cowboy had ridden into town for supplies and left with a bride who changed his life forever. The end.